So, Fabian, welcome to my podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
What brought you to Norway?
So I'm doing my PhD here at the University of Oslo with the Oslo Nuclear Project. 4-year contract, gonna complete my PhD, and then we'll see where I'm heading.
So, tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you start? What did you start studying, and what did you get into first? And where did you grow up also?
Oh yeah, sure. So I grew up in Fellberg, which is a very small village in Germany. I guess compared to Norwegian villages and standards, it would almost count as a town. I noticed when I was road tripping through Norway that basically villages or towns larger than 5,000 inhabitants, they are indicated on the highway already.
Yeah.
That would never be the case with the town where I'm from.
Oh,
but
really?
but here here it is, yeah. So it's the suburb of a suburb of Stuttgart. That was the next biggest city. And then I did my bachelor's at the University of Groningen in international relations in the Netherlands. After that, I did my master's degree in war studies at King's College London. That was during Corona times though, so I did that from abroad. And in the meantime, I lived with my girlfriend in Estonia, in Tartu, which was really nice. Then I worked for about 10 months in Berlin as a research assistant for the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is a think tank working pretty much on the same topics that I'm also now working on as a PhD student. And then the PhD position was offered and I applied, and that's how I got here.
But what got you interested in international relations in the first place? Did you have that interest all the way from when you were a kid? Was it like influenced by your parents? Where do you think that interest came from?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I think I had a really a very early interest in history, and especially military history, which is there was a bit of a tension with my father to some extent, because my father, my grandpa, he came from a relatively affluent family in what was back then Eastern Prussia, and his family having quite some money when he entered, or when World War II started, he was a relatively high-ranking German officer. And when my dad grew up, he went completely counterculture. And he went absolutely against anything that had to do with military and, Prussian standards and whatsoever. And he went a lot of protests that the whole 68 leftist revolution in Germany. Colored statues, threw paint at statues, all that sort of stuff. And then I grew up and I got suddenly really interested in all these military things, but from back then from a historical background. But so in some sense I also went counterculture, and I think from there it somewhat developed. So I remember relatively early on, probably 9, 10, I would go through history books, but I was mostly interested in the technologies, the weapon systems that were used for all the different time periods. I actually really enjoyed reading about that. And then as I got older, I think the interest shifted more towards politics. And then I did a lot of the Model United Nations simulations already in high school. I'm not sure if you know that.
No, tell more.
So that is basically a lot of university students that do that, and I also did it while I was at university. It's a simulation game where the high school student for a day or two or several more, depending on the format, you take over the role of a country in a certain United Nations council.
Mm-hmm.
It could be the General Assembly, the Security Council, whatever is offered. And I was lucky enough that my high school, they offered one of these simulations each year. And before I was allowed to participate, because I think the threshold was 14 or 15, I always watched, it was right at the end of the school year, so nothing was that serious anymore. And sometimes the teachers were like, if you have nothing to do anymore, just go and watch.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked that. And so the moment I could join, I did. And I think that is then the first time that this interest in war, conflict, collided a bit with politics, because then I was really interested in the international relations, politics stuff, but especially where it collided with international security. So I think that is then where this interest really emerged in international relations, especially from more a security standpoint. And then I really wanted to study international relations. In Germany, it's a bit tricky. There's only one study program offered at one university, and you have to get perfect grades basically to get in, which I did not have. I wasn't bad student, but I was, I think, a bit above average. And so, then the other option was to go abroad. And actually, my mom at one point, she brought up the idea that, Fabian, you could also just quickly learn Dutch, because for German, that's not that difficult for a year or so. And then you do your bachelor's in Dutch if you really want to study that. And at one point, I looked it actually up, and it turned out that most of the programs nowadays in the Netherlands are completely offered in English.
Uh-huh.
And so I went to the Netherlands. I applied for the program in English, international relations, got accepted, went there. And in the beginning, I was, really into, I think probably from my Model United Nations background, I was also really interested in international organizations and how they shape the international environment. But from there, it evolved further and further away from this cooperative international relations idea towards more the conflict and war side that really fascinated me. Because I think, in the end, at one point, you just realize that power is the currency of the international system, and power is the thing that moves things along or holds things to a grind. And so then I got really interested in that. I think I wrote my bachelor thesis. I wrote it on cyber war. So that's also then when the technology angle came back a bit. And during my master's degree, I took that further and further, and kind of specialized a bit in the direction of nuclear strategy and nuclear weapons policy. Between my bachelor's and master, I read extremely widely. I read a lot of academic books just for fun. I have no idea how I did that. Couldn't do that nowadays anymore. But I really enjoyed doing that. I think that is then how this interest fostered more towards the nuclear strategy side. And that's how I got into nuclear weapons. And I think I was really content with that for a while. And at one point, I got to the point where I was nuclear weapons are really interesting and they're really important. I'm sure we're going to talk a bit about them later on. But they're also boring. It sounds weird, but they, these weapons, they're so powerful. They're so destructive. They have such an symbolistic aura of power that they're not very agile in a way, if that makes sense.
Absolute.
Yeah, exactly. And I was then I was super interested. I became super interested in missile technology, and I did an internship at a German think tank, and there it was basically they kind of were Fabian, we want to write something about cruise missiles and cruise missile proliferation, and just sit in your office and work on a database for, I think, 2 or 3 months, where I just collected every piece of data I can on all the different cruise missile programs in the world. And that's how I got really into missile technology. And now what I did during my PhD is I kind of combine these interests. So there's this interest in nuclear strategy, but also conventional missile technology. And where do they intersect? And there are a couple of really interesting points, and we can touch upon them later. That is at least what I applied to initially with that PhD project in mind. But, as you can imagine, a PhD project always evolves from the moment you start to, you do initial research, refine your research questions. And actually, I moved kind of more and more away from the nuclear strategy side. It's still there. It still has a good component. But right now, so far, most of the research I've conducted and what I'm really happy with working in that field is on conventional missile technology and looking at their specific implications on modern war.
Do you think your motivation through all of this, through garnering all this kind of information and education and thinking about these things, is there like a general motivation there for getting to know how to prevent war? How can we prevent war? How can we analyze this? How can we get less war in the world? Do you think that is one of the general motivations of your work?
I think there was definitely in the beginning, there was part of it. Also has a bit to do probably with my German background. You know, in Germany, this topic of war, you know, is a bit a touchy topic, and if you discuss it academically, very often you have to do so from a normative background that is focused on arms control, crisis prevention, disarmament. If you compare that, for example, to the United States or the United Kingdom, there you have more this strategic studies tradition where it's not just about arms control or disarmament. It's also, you know, like, well, simply studying, you know, what do these weapon systems do? What are their implications? Accepting that violence and weapons technology is a fact of the world, a fact of reality. So detaching yourself a bit from that normative background, and I think that is something that I moved towards in the throughout my education. That I also started with this more normative background. I was really focused on arms control in the beginning, and right now, you know, it's well, I would say the arms control it's still important, and you know, if my research can contribute to lessening risks of general war or nuclear war or crisis, I'm really happy with that. But I would not say I would say this is not the main focus of my research. First and foremost, it's about understanding the reality that we're living in, because I think, you know, like that's extremely important. Like, just because you are not interested in nuclear weapons or any kind of weapons, that doesn't mean that these weapons are not interested in you.
Yeah, that's true. Because I talk to a lot of people, and I think a lot of people have good intentions when they say things like, if we didn't have a military, there wouldn't be any war. But I think that's a kind of naive thinking, because not all people are the same, and some people are more aggressive. Some leaders in the world want to take over different land areas. They want to take over countries. And just because you don't think you have any evil in you doesn't mean that other people don't find that evil tempting to go to war and have an offensive war. And therefore, I think we need to realize that we don't live in a perfect world, and we need to have defenses, because perhaps there always will be war. Do you think? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Do you think war has always been a part of mankind? It's like in our nature that war is always has gone on and always will go on in some kind of shape or form. It's just a part of our nature almost.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we could dive super deep into international relations theory, because that is the core question at the heart of the subject, and there are very different competing theories out there. So, for example, some theories explain that with the evil nature of humans themselves, or the power-hungry nature, that individuals are just naturally driven towards power, which then translates into the desire of states to seek gains through aggression. There are other explanations, for example, that, you know, the structure of the international system. So depending on how many great powers you have, the more likely or less likely it is that there will be war. So there's a bunch of competing theories out there trying to explain why war is a recurring feature of the international system. My research is not trying to answer these big questions. But yeah, if you ask me, probably war and violence, it will stick with us unless something fundamentally changes, which I don't see happening.
No. And it's a very special situation that we have right now with Russia and Ukraine. Like, it's the first time we'd had like war on European soil since World War II.
Yeah.
It's a very strange situation to be in. But I'll also, before we dive into that, perhaps touch on these big subjects a little more, because I've heard also a statistic that there's less war now than there's ever been in the world at any point. That perhaps we see more of the wars because we see a lot of media, and media wants to fill it in their TV spots and everything, because therefore we're more exposed to it, but that doesn't mean statistically that there's actually more of it. So do you know anything about that as pertains to like statistically? Is there less war in the world right now?
Oh, I don't have a perfect answer to that. I know, like, I have a lot of colleagues at my department who do excellent research on that, and I wouldn't dare be speculating here. I would say though that, you know, a bit anecdotal, but my grandma, before she passed away, she would always in phone calls, you know, sometimes, or like I would say like every second phone call, she would get like very sad at one point and be like, yeah, it really feels like in this world something went out of balance and it's not the same anymore, and something has changed. And she was a really old person, so I just accepted it and was like, yeah, you know, it's all right, and I didn't go too deep into it. But I really think, you know, part of why things feel so bad sometimes is just because you see them 24/7.
Yeah,
you're just exposed to it all the time. I look at the war in Ukraine, you know, like there's like I mean, there has never been a war that has been broadcast so widely in all its different facets. I mean, you know, prior to the war, honestly, I don't know if I ever saw a real person die in a video or a video clip. And now there's just something, you know, if you scroll through Twitter, you can almost not avoid it anymore. So like that is how like the real death of real people in real war is just incredibly close to you.
Yeah.
And yeah, that has definitely changed.
So you can say, like, just thinking out loud here, perhaps there's both positives and negatives to that. Like the positive is that we get a more realistic image of what the world is, what war is, what death is, like, as opposed to just being distanced from it, like reading it in the paper on some black and white font on paper. It's more, you get it more up and close and in your face, like this is death, this is real. Try to get that veil between you and reality away, like this is what life is, this is what war is. On the negative side, I think that perhaps that could also make us like immune to it. You know, like you see it every day, like it's crying wolf wolf, like in the end you don't care anymore because you see it every day. Oh, another person died, okay, what else is on the news? Like you get that kind of effect perhaps that you don't, because you're exposed to it all the time, so it gets normalized.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's you know, like to some extent I feel like you almost, at least working in the field, you have to detach yourself from the human suffering on some level, and that is necessary, because otherwise, you know, you go crazy. On the other hand, yeah, it's also a challenge, right? Because you don't want to, I mean, you don't want to become an emotionless robot.
Yeah.
I have this discussion with my girlfriend sometimes, you know, who tells me like, Fabian, this affects you less than it should.
Yeah.
And she's probably correct, you know, like at some point you, like being confronted with that. I mean, for me, it's probably extreme, and my colleagues like working so closely with it. But I would also say probably for the average citizen, I mean, probably this war, like especially this war in Ukraine, has changed something, that we're just like overexposed to violence almost.
Yeah, do you think working with war and studying war has changed you since, like, if you think back before you started this, has it changed some part of you? Has it like hardened you or toughened you to be able to withstand those kinds of impressions?
Yeah, I feel like hardened and toughened, you know, like they're weird terminology to speak about that. No, it's definitely that you manage to put some distance between you, the pictures, and the emotions. I would say probably I was, you know, like naturally somewhat inclined to have a bit more resilience in that regard, because probably one of the reasons why you get interested in the first place, or like why you can withstand it, you know, right? Like if you, for example, like my dad, who gets very emotional when he sees these pictures, and that's totally fine. But probably then, my career choice would just not come natural to him. So probably, I am by no means a psychologist, so I have no idea, but probably there is like some people probably naturally are just more or less receptive than others, would be my guess. But yeah,
but also probably since you can find meaning in the work that you do, that meaning is more important than your own emotional reaction to what you're seeing. So it's important work, therefore you have to like raise above being bottlenecked by your own emotions about the subject.
Yeah, I mean, it's not for me to say, like how important my work is. In the best case, that is judged by others. Yeah. I think, all I can do is, just try it, like do my best analysis, and put it out there, and then see how that is received.
Yeah, because I've seen your name a few times, different places where you're picked up, like in Sky News, they cite you on what you're saying, and different kinds of places. Has that been more now in the Ukraine situation? And when did you start getting calls from the media and to tell them about your thoughts?
So the first time it happened, that was like right around when the Ukraine war started. And, especially when Russia started its nuclear posturing, like don't intervene, there will be massive consequences, and there's a risk of nuclear war at all times. So that is when my colleagues especially, but also myself, we got quite a few media requests, just, people are asking about that topic. That slowed down. It was actually like nothing for a really long time. And then 3 weeks ago on 11 May, the United Kingdom, they decided to send the Storm Shadow cruise missile to Ukraine, which is, was quite a significant development, very strong upgrade to Ukraine's long-range strike capability. And given that my expertise is centered around conventional missile technology, and there are not that many people who study that topic in Europe, I think that's when people started reaching out. And that was partially probably also just because I did a thread on Twitter that was really successful. And I think that's how a lot of people and also journalists just started following me and recognizing the name. And then they started to reach out. I think a good friend of mine, Benjamin Tallis, he put that in a tweet, and I think he said it very well. In Europe, we kind of lost our nuclear IQ after the Cold War. It's just something we've not been thinking about at all. It was just something, relic of the past, something that should be forgotten. And, for a couple of years, almost 2 decades, it seemed like that strategy kind of works. But then suddenly nuclear weapons are back on the table. Everyone's talking about them. Our adversaries are very happy to include them in their coercive strategies to promote their international objectives. And then, you have a lack of expertise. You have a lack of people who can provide insights into these topics. And then, Oslo Nuclear Project being created. It's a new center of excellence here in Europe. And I know that my colleagues, they have also briefed a bunch of decision makers in Norway, but also abroad. So, for example, I regularly speak to German decision makers when I'm back in Berlin. And I think that has been very effective. And it really has shifted a bit, like the landscape. So you still have the vast majority of expertise and knowledge is still centered in the United States. Paradoxically, the United Kingdom has vanished more and more into the background. Also, what nuclear weapons research, what regards nuclear weapons research. And then, you have this new center of excellence springing up in Europe. Oslo Nuclear Project is definitely one of them. But you also have really good work done nowadays, for example, in Zurich, in Switzerland. I would say in Germany, we've also there's also been some progress. So some more nuanced thinking on the topic from a variety of backgrounds. So I think overall, like you see Europeans becoming more interested into nuclear strategy and nuclear weapons policy. And I think that's very good. And overall, I think the Oslo Nuclear Project, as the first proper center of excellence with really this idea of bringing back expertise. I think it did a really good job there. But that was long before I started even.
From my perspective, it seems like there has been some kind of nuclear balance between the big states, superpowers like US and Russia, in that they've had like almost the same amount of nuclear power. And that this is shifting now with the rhetoric that Putin is coming with rattling his sabers about using them actually, and then all the way down to like from the strategic to the tactical nuclear weapons and the possibility and risk of actually using them and all this. So I want to dive into all of this stuff, but first perhaps what do you think is there a greater risk now of nuclear weapons being used than before the Ukraine-Russia war?
Yes, but I don't, and I want to say that immediately, I don't think there is a high risk of nuclear use in Ukraine. Obviously, it's non-zero. I think saying that would be wild. So there is a chance, but I would say, from my personal perspective, and I know some of my colleagues disagree with me on that, but I have a very strong opinion that I don't think we will see nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine, simply because I do not think it supports Putin's objectives in any way. It's very counterproductive for Putin to even think about nuclear weapons use.
Why do you think it's counterproductive for him to think that?
So, well, I wrote an op-ed for Morgenposten on that topic, and was told no, Putin will not use nuclear weapons. And basically, it comes down to three things. Let's see if I get all of them. So first of all, right, Russia is already extremely isolated in the international system. They lack access to markets, access to resources. And that's a huge issue for them. And so far, actually, with their reserve stockpiles, they could wither the sanctions quite well. And we have to see how that translates into the next 12 to 24 months. But overall, it has been extremely tough. And two of the saving graces for Russia was that on the one hand, you had India, which picked up, some of the oil imports that could now not go, or exports that could now not go to Europe anymore. That gave a bit of cash flow to Putin. And then, of course, you also had China. China is a bit interesting because, in press conferences, China is always saying, yeah, it's a friendship without limits and Russia is our partner. But then if you actually look what they're doing, yeah, they're tacitly supporting Putin, but they are extremely hesitant to build up or to provide any sort of substantial assistance to Putin in his war. And let's say Putin starts exploding a nuclear weapon somewhere, whether it is a signaling strike over an unpopulated area, or whether it is frontline use to destroy a Ukrainian brigade, or whether it is a city. No matter what, I think the moment Putin uses a nuclear weapons, China and India, they can no longer support Putin in any way. And they have actually made that clear. Like, they have made clear, there was last November, I think, at the G20 summit, when both India and China have repeatedly emphasized in press conferences, no, nuclear weapons use would be irresponsible. Talking about nuclear weapons use is irresponsible. And you have seen a significant drop in the nuclear rhetoric of Putin and Lavrov and other Russian decision makers after that. So he knows that. He knows that like his last two allies, and I say allies in big quotation marks because they're not really allies, they would be gone immediately. And his isolation would be, North Korea times 10 probably.
Yeah.
So that cannot be in his interest. That's the one factor. Then the second one is just that, let's say he says, okay, it doesn't matter if I'm isolated or not. I believe that exploding a nuclear weapon can do me good in this conflict right now. Then, of course, is the question, okay, what do you do? Where do you explode it? Under what circumstances? What do you want to achieve? And here I think Also, that there's no scenario where a nuclear weapon can actually have any real impact. Let's look at a signaling strike, right? So you explode a nuclear weapon over an unpopulated area, could be, over the Black Sea, could be over just an unpopulated area in Ukraine or in Russia. You're just signaling to your adversary, look, I am willing to use nuclear weapons. And if you don't give in, the next one will land on your territory, on your population. So what would that do? It would do nothing. I mean, all it would actually do is instigate more assistance for Ukraine, because Putin has just crossed an enormous threshold, and you have the backlash of China and India dropping support. Then you could say, okay, but tactical nuclear weapons, they can have a real effect on the front line. That was true. That was maybe true during the Cold War, but definitely not true nowadays in the context of Ukraine. So let me explain that. Mm-hmm. During the Cold War, you know the Fulda Gap. Have you heard of that?
No.
Yeah. So no, the Fulda Gap is basically if you imagine the front line, the would-be front line between the East and West in a confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that ran through Germany along the borders of Eastern and Western Germany, and there is a particular part of that front line called the Fulda Gap, and that is basically the area where tank columns could have advanced the easiest, because the terrain is pretty amenable to that kind of push. So the Soviets knew that if they want to attack, or if they want to take over Western Germany and then hopefully the rest of NATO and defeat them, they have to push through that Fulda Gap. And the Western Germans knew, well, we have to defend that Fulda Gap. So if the Fulda Gap is breached, then we're in big trouble. So what you see is that both sides, they obviously massed huge columns of divisions. I mean, it's not just, nowadays we mostly talk often about battalions and brigades, but those were divisions. So divisions, they have like a size of 10 to 20,000 men, hundreds, if not thousands of vehicles and tanks in them. And they amassed, like, I don't know the exact numbers, but there must have been dozens, right? Like dozens of divisions just to either protect the Fulda Gap or breach through the Fulda Gap. So you have a huge concentration of forces protecting a comparatively small area. So if you think about it, this is an ideal target for a tactical nuclear weapon. Because what can a nuclear weapon do that a conventional weapon cannot? It's to take out a lot of things, a lot of destruction in a very short amount of time that you just cannot do with any other type of weapon system. So in that sense, employing tactical nuclear weapons, actually, you can say it makes sense. You can still say, well, morally it's abhorrent. Politically, it could be counterproductive, but militarily speaking, I can see the purpose behind it.
As a side note, how much more destructive is a tactical nuclear weapon compared to the strongest, most destructive conventional weapons?
So I think the strongest conventional weapon, it's basically, there would be 11 tons of TNT.
Yeah.
And then a tactical nuclear weapon that starts with 1 kiloton.
Yeah.
That is already 1,000 tons of TNT equivalent. So vastly more powerful.
Yeah.
Can hardly compare that. And if you look at, for example, a missile that Kongsberg produces, an anti-ship missile that has a 125 kilogram warhead, which it's a lot. Like that can destroy a ship like easily, or a house, completely blow it up.
Yeah.
But like that's you see, like it's not 1,000 tons of TNT.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. Yeah. The amount of destruction that is packed in a small nuclear warhead.
Yeah.
But then, like tactical nuclear weapon, I mean, it varies, right? Like the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was, for example, 16.4 kilotons.
Mm-hmm.
And then the tactical nuclear weapons that we assume Russia would use in a contingency, they're between 10 and 50 kilotons.
Wow.
So that is, like already more than
Hiroshima.
destroyed
Wow.
Hiroshima. Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy. Because Hiroshima is like what most people think about when they think about like strategic nuclear weapons like ICBMs, and they picture that. And then actually that is now in 2023 the power of a tactical nuclear weapon. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a lot. But then, if you go to the strategic nuclear warheads, that then gets really crazy. I mean, then you go to the 100 kilotons, 200 kilotons, up to several megatons.
Yeah.
So like thousands of...
So crazy. I heard about that missile they have that they call Satan, which has that called in the Russian nuclear strategic super heavy ICBM.
Yeah.
Do you think those are just meant for symbolic purposes? Like when they're built, like we will never use these are not meant to be used. These are just like symbolic things that we drag out when we have our shows in the parade in Kremlin and everything, and we'll never use this. Do you think they have that kind of thinking about it, or do you think they have like a more practical thinking around them, like how will we actually use this when we need to use this? What do you think is like their mindset around them?
I mean, that's the paradox of the nuclear age, that you need to build and deploy these weapon systems in a way that they will always be usable, and you always have to have employability in mind. So it makes no sense of building these things without thinking about, when and how will I use them. Mm-hmm. But then you actually build them because you never want to use them.
Yeah.
Because their prime purpose is deterrence.
Yeah.
It's, the ultimate guarantor of sovereignty and national survival. The reason why I think nuclear disarmament will not happen.
Yeah.
I don't think, we can go into that later. Yeah. But I think, it's such a powerful tool for states to have to ensure their survival in a violent and dangerous international system. I don't think they will be willing to give that up. But should we get back to Ukraine? Yeah. So Fulda Gap, huge concentration of forces. Militarily speaking, it may make sense to, explode a couple of tactical nuclear warheads over that Fulda Gap area, wipe out a bunch of divisions immediately, and then have your armored columns push through deep into enemy territory. Now you look at Ukraine. And in Ukraine, and that's generally speaking nowadays, I mean, force numbers since the Cold War have dropped heavily. And most of the maps that you will see of Ukraine, where they analyze the specific force concentrations and which force component is deployed where, they don't even speak about divisions. It's mostly about brigades and battalions. So that is a brigade. Always depends a bit which country, but it's, let's say, like 2,000 to 3,000 men.
Yeah, could we take that as a side note also, just to explain to people, like brigade, division, all those? Where do we start? What's the smallest unit?
So the smallest one is a firing squad, right? Like it's 2 people holding a gun, maybe a bigger one. Then you go up to a squad, which is going to be like 4 to 5 people. Then you get a platoon, which depends, like 25 to 50 maybe. Then you get a company, let's say up to 500. Then you get a battalion, around 1,000. Then you get the brigade, so 2,000 to 3,000. Just ballpark numbers, right? So I know, for example, in Norway, a company will have significantly less men than in the United States, just because it's way smaller proportionally. So you get brigade, and then you get the division, which like 10 to 20,000. If the country deploys that, even like the Norway does not have a division, it stops at the brigade level. I think Germany deploys like what, or they aim at deploying like 2 or 3 tank divisions, and that's it. And I mean, during the Cold War, I don't know, but like there were dozens of tank divisions alone in Germany, and many more in overall all NATO countries. And then you can also go above that, and then you get like the Corps, which is the theater grouping of several divisions.
Yeah, like they call in the US like the Marine Corps.
The Marine Corps, exactly. And then you get the overall army. So that basically like the overall force numbers, they're just not high enough to even warrant deploying divisions, because the front line is too big. It doesn't make sense to have like 2 or 3 brigades like in one area, because you just have to cover too much. And that's really important for nuclear weapons use, because as I just said, employing these weapon systems makes most sense if you have a lot of equipment, a lot of manpower in a small area that you can take out with a concentrated strike. And under most circumstances, it's just not something that you will get in Ukraine. If you look at the Kharkiv offensive last September, apparently the number of tanks employed in that offensive were 16. 16 around a pretty big area. So I would say, like with dropping 1 tactical nuclear weapons, you probably wouldn't even get half of the tanks. So then like you drop the nuclear weapon, you get all the political backlash that I just talked about, and you destroyed 8 tanks or something like that. Like the military, simply there is not enough force concentration in Ukraine to warrant the use of nuclear weapons, to make it militarily make sense. So like then the only purpose it can have is like a shock purpose, a psychological one,
a symbolic.
But like but then that's where then we go back to scenario 1, right? Like you have no real impact, but you have a shit ton of political backlash. So why would you want to do it? I don't get it. And that's the third reason. And that's the overwhelming one. Putin knows if he uses nuclear weapons, NATO cannot stand outside this conflict anymore. NATO will have to get involved, because if Putin employs a nuclear weapon and we don't get involved in the conflict, well, then you will see a lot of proliferation all around the world. You will basically see the entire security structure breaking down. I mean, if we let Putin get away with impunity for employing a nuclear weapon, I mean, what is like all our normative values that we built up over the last decades, our system, what is it worth? I would say nothing at that point. And I'm pretty sure the United States and the allies, they know that. And they have communicated that to Putin. So Biden has said, like in public statements, I'm pretty sure through backdoor channels that has been reiterated several times, if you start employing nuclear weapons in Ukraine, we will put an end to your special military operation extremely fast. And to do that, NATO does not even need to put boots on the ground. So I'm pretty sure that the United States alone, they could deploy a massed cruise missile strike. So let's say we send 500 to 1,000 cruise missiles at every military relevant target inside Ukraine that is valuable to Russia, and let's say in the border area, strike every of these targets with 2 or 3 cruise missiles. This military operation is over. There is nothing left. And that is a very credible threat, because that is something that's very easy for the United States to do, right? Like we don't need to start amassing our troops first. We don't need to start deploying tanks in Ukraine. No, like the only threat that we have to make credibly, and I think we make that credibly, is that with a massive airstrike, especially by the United States, but other countries would join, we can end your military operation in an hour. And Putin knows that. I'm 100% convinced of that. And that is if you think like the 2 reasons before that were not convincing enough, this is the single one reason why I know that Putin, or let's say Putin steps down and another person comes in, that person will have the same threat communicated to him or her. So that's why I don't see any scenario where nuclear weapons could produce any benefit for Putin. And then, like the last, because, I have a lot of heated debates with people about that. And then the last argument always is, but what if Putin is not rational? Or what if Russia is just completely irrational? I always say, look, the first thing I always say is that right now, Putin's moves, they have not necessarily been very smart, but there was always an element to rationality behind this. So you see that, for example, the prime example is, had Putin not announced mobilization at the end of last year, his front would have collapsed probably around now, because there's just not enough manpower. And he's going to start struggling again with manpower very soon. And Putin knew that mobilization is a big risk it will carry political backlash, which it did in Russia. It was manageable, but he really, really did not want to do it. And he only did it once he really had no other choice. But then he was like, okay, I guess I got to do it. So to me, that shows that he actually has thought a lot about this, and he's still very calculating, very rational. So that is the one thing. And then the second one, well, if we now just assume that Putin is not rational anymore, I mean, what then is the purpose of all this thinking, right? Like, it's just that's something we have to assume. Yeah. Like, otherwise, our policy making cannot make sense, because I cannot react, or I cannot try to rationalize the actions of an irrational actor. So I just think that's a stupid cognitive standpoint to take. Almost.
I think it's almost something that we do as like a mental defense mechanism, because he's so Putin seems so evil that we try to explain it away with he must be irrational. Nobody could be that evil. Like, it's something like that in that direction. But I also want to ask you about that scenario 3 that you talked about. Like, NATO has to get involved if they fire a nuclear weapon. Do you think that NATO would have to get involved regardless of whether that is a strategic nuclear weapon or tactical nuclear weapon, or whether they fire it upon the landmass of Ukraine itself, or whether they do a test firing somewhere in the Black Sea? Do you think that happens regardless of all those scenarios? Or let's say they just fire one in the sea somewhere with no fatalities. Do you think NATO would still get involved? What do you think would happen then if they do that?
So the only scenario where I think it's somewhat uncertain is where it's over an unpopulated area outside Ukraine with no casualties. Then there is a question. And I think maybe it's then not even necessary for NATO to get involved, because, like, the backlash that Russia will receive from like China and India dropping it like a fly will be enough. But the moment something happens on Ukrainian soil, no question.
But what do you think would be the response from Europe and the US and NATO if they did that? What do you think we would do?
So I'm pretty sure there's a contingency plan in place. And a bunch of measures would be taken. So what you would probably see is so with regard to the airstrike, right? Like, you have to coordinate that logistically. That would be difficult. So I would say that takes like 24 to 48 hours to get all the assets to Europe. Probably that would be somewhat choreographed, and probably would see a lot of threats from Russia in the meantime. I don't think that can matter at this point, because you have to react. The United States, like, they basically, for them, it's then get enough fighter aircraft and bombers to deploy a large number of cruise missiles in a single strike.
You think they do that even though Russia like fired a nuclear weapon just in the sea somewhere?
No, that is not. No. Like, that is the only instance where I think it would be a question of what exactly would happen. But if something happens inside Ukrainian territory, you don't have a choice anymore.
But in the sea would probably be like even more economic sanctions, even more ammunition and support for Ukraine, even more like indirect support. Exactly.
I would say, like, the big challenge is, like, in this airstrike scenario, like, that's the thing, like, it doesn't automatically mean you have World War III. It could be that Russia just steps down after that. It could obviously be that it starts attacking NATO territory. So one thing, I would be basically one thing I'm more concerned about is let's say NATO gets involved in the war. I'm not that much concerned that the war could be confined to between Russia and NATO inside Ukraine. I think you can do that. I'm a bit more concerned about what happens, around the other borders. So let's see what happens in Estonia, or also around Kaliningrad. And again, I'm pretty sure, like, the NATO member states, so Poland, for example, they have a pretty good contingency plan, what they're doing in that situation. Probably. I'm pretty sure they probably have plans to take out Kaliningrad in 24 to 48 hours, something like that. But like that would be a bit of a challenge, right? Because then that is how this war expands. So I mean, pure speculation. We don't know what's going to happen in that moment. But yeah, I mean, I hope it never gets to that. But I just think, if Russia fires a nuclear weapon on Ukraine, there's nothing.
That's it.
No choice.
Yeah. But let's speculate about this. Let's go in the thinking of this. Let's go, if they do fire a tactical weapon in Ukraine, and then we have NATO, US led mission, take out the whole perhaps Black Fleet with 500 cruise missiles and all these military strategic things. And let's say, what happens, different scenarios with regard to how Russia reacts. Like Putin could, he could step down and say, okay, I don't want any more casualties. Let's drop this whole war. But also, it's like, I'm thinking he doesn't want to lose. He doesn't see that as an opportunity or a real choice for him, perhaps. And then he says, okay, they want to get involved. Okay, I have these ICBMs standing here. Perhaps I should press my big red button and fire one or two of those at Washington and perhaps New York. And do you think that is a realistic scenario, that he could say, like, okay, we go from tactical to strategic nuclear weapons now?
I don't think immediately. I think there would need to be a threat that NATO decapitates the Russian nuclear arsenal before, or destroys the nuclear arsenal before Russia has a chance to fire it. I think then he would be willing to preempt. Yeah. So then he would be willing to launch first. I think, what happens, so let's say that airstrike came in, the entire logistical capabilities, air defense sites, Black Sea Fleet, troop concentrations inside and outside Ukraine around the border area are destroyed. So it's pretty clear that, this military operation is over. Russia has absolutely no chance of winning that war anymore. It happens then, it depends largely on what happens. I think the next step depends on what happens inside the Kremlin. So is there an attempt of getting rid of Putin? How much control does he still have? Because then, he has the choice, okay, either I employ more tactical nuclear weapons to halt a NATO advance. But that's the thing, right? That's what I just said. NATO does not need to deploy ground troops. We have the power to end this military operation without deploying a single tank into Russia. That's not necessary. We don't need to roll into the Kremlin to defeat him. Then it depends. It also depends on NATO, to what extent can we credibly convince the Russian counterparts that we are not interested in regime change or in in taking over certain parts of Russia, installing control. We have no interest in conquering Russia, but we probably would have to credibly signal in some way that we're not looking to break up Russia right now. Even though, personally, right, that would be, I don't see, if Putin starts using nuclear weapons, regime change and breaking up Russia probably would have to be the objectives. But that's not something you can then credibly signal, because then you get into the territory where nuclear weapons use might become realistic.
And if we have a strategic nuclear weapons exchange, it's all over. Then
it's over anyways. But that's the thing. We don't want that.
No.
But Russia also doesn't want that. What's Putin's number one motivator? It's his idea of a grand place in Russian history, equal to the Tsar himself. So, if he's the one who in the end started a war that ended up completely destroying Russia and the rest of the world, that's also
good job.
That's not what he. I don't know. I don't think that is what he wants in any way.
Also, they have this the Russian nuclear doctrine, which says that if their existence as a country is threatened, then they are allowed to use nuclear weapons.
That is the one instance where you can credibly threaten strategic nuclear weapons use. And that is, the main purpose of these weapon systems. That's what we discussed earlier. They are the ultimate guarantor of national survival and sovereignty.
And
it makes sense of threatening their use when this is at stake.
I had Professor Tormod Heier here, who works at FFI, Forsvarets Forskningsinstitutt, who said that also that the one who wants to maintain the peace always has to be ready for war, that Latin expression. So it's really important with that kind of deterrence. And I want to talk about that. What is the nuclear balance of deterrence in the world right now, as you see it?
Actually, if you just look at nuclear weapon numbers, things are not very different from the end of the Cold War. Actually, they are in the sense that both sides, or both Russia and the United States, they disarmed a part of their arsenal, so the arsenals shrunk, but the overall balance is the same. So the United States and Russia, under their current treaty obligations, which actually Russia has suspended, I believe. So we will see where it goes from there. But right now, both deploy around 1,550 nuclear warheads on, I think, 800 delivery vehicles. So delivery vehicle could be an ICBM, could be a strategic bomber, could be a submarine-launched ballistic missile. So that is a delivery vehicle, and you can mount more than one warhead on a delivery vehicle. That's why you have more warheads than delivery vehicle numbers. So that's the balance, and that balance is pretty stable. We will have to see now that Russia has suspended its obligations under the treaty, what the United States and Russia will do. I don't think neither is very interested in building up their arsenal right now. For Russia, it would be too expensive. I think for the United States, they don't have to. If you look at China always was an interesting case because they did not play the game of they did not want to join this arms race game. They said a small number of nuclear weapons that are survivable are enough to deter any kind of aggression.
Because you only need so much. Like, how many times do you want to destroy the world over?
Exactly. And so the Chinese said, well, I don't need 1,550 warheads to do that. I need, basically, if I can threaten credibly that, let's say, 3 warheads will arrive on target in 3 cities, and I can destroy 3 cities of yours, that's probably enough, right? You don't need a lot more. So they always maintained like an arsenal around 200 warheads, but they have actually upping that. So they've broken out of their own set limits, and they're building up more nuclear weapons. And then, of course, it's a bit interesting then what's happening with the United States. Do they have to respond to that, or what do they want to respond to that? And there's a bunch of considerations which we can talk about later. And well, we of course have like a bunch of other more regional nuclear powers. So United Kingdom, France, Pakistan, India.
Let's talk about that. Which countries in the world actually have nuclear weapons?
So it's United States, Russia, and China. So it's the 3 biggest ones.
Those are the ones with like strategic ICBMs.
Most have. So those are the big, like the great powers or major powers deploying. I wouldn't say, Russia is not a great power anymore, but like a major power. And then you have regional powers. So that is France and the United Kingdom in Europe. In South Asia, you've got Pakistan and India. And then you've got North Korea. I think that's it. If I forgot one, I apologize to everyone. Because I should know that, but I think I got them all.
About Iran?
Iran. I mean, they might proliferate next, right? Like they are the number one potential proliferator. Israel. I knew I forgot one. Israel. So of course it's Israel. But like Israel is also special because they never, they somewhat now acknowledged it. But they are a bit murky. So like they're not going out there saying, "Hey, we have a nuclear arsenal." They have very implicitly stated it in a bunch of like press conferences here and there, but they don't really admit to it. So they're a bit an exception there.
And there's also one that we should talk about that actually had nuclear weapons before the 1994 memorandum in Budapest, where Ukraine, I've heard, actually had nuclear weapons in their country, which they gave away in returns for the promise that the US would protect them in case of an attack. So what do you think about that situation? Should Ukraine have kept their nuclear weapons, and perhaps we wouldn't have this situation because of deterrence that we're in right now if they had nuclear weapons?
Actually, there were 2 countries who had nuclear weapons at one point and gave them up. The other one was South Africa. Also an interesting case. I don't think, on paper, Ukraine possessed a nuclear capability at one point. I don't think it was operational. Because what happened is they inherited the ICBM silos and the mobile missile launchers with the nuclear missiles inside them. And then, of course, also with the warheads. But, the center of the Soviet Union, so Russia, they maintained very strict control over the launch procedures for them.
So they actually had, in practice, they were the ones controlling them.
And a lot of quite a bit of the technology surrounding nuclear weapons was also, centralized in and around Moscow. So, on paper, they possessed a very substantial nuclear arsenal, but, it definitely was not usable in the sense they could just have decided to launch it. You can make the argument, that they could maybe reverse engineer it. So like keep the nuclear missiles, learn the technology, and then deploy your own. And actually, Ukraine, they have, prior to the war, they had a ballistic missile program. The Crom ballistic missile. And, there's a lot of speculation whether they turned that into a crash program. And probably they have. And I'm pretty sure, depending on how long this war continues, if it, let's say, goes on for another 12 to 24 months, I'm pretty sure we're going to see Ukrainian ballistic missiles. So they've taken some of the technology. What they have not done is, or what appear to have done is, open up a nuclear warhead and look at the different kind of technology, because it's a complex piece of technology, right?
There's a reason why only the largest countries in the world actually have nuclear weapons.
No, so the thing is, the nuclear warhead itself. So getting the critical mass that makes big boom, that's pretty easy. The stuff around it, that's more complex. So especially if you have a long range delivery vehicle like an ICBM, incredibly difficult. Actually, really impressed by North Koreans for having done that in actually really short amount of time. And also, South Africa. One of the reason why I think they were very willing to give up their nuclear arsenal is because they had the nuclear warheads. They built up a very rudimentary bomb that could be dropped from an aircraft, but nothing beyond that. So, the first step, getting the critical mass together, here the challenge is to get enough uranium and plutonium. But once you have that, I can turn that into an explosive device rather easily. But if I want to make it a sophisticated one that actually, has a lot of the political utility that we want from nuclear weapons, then it gets complicated. And that's the thing. Ukraine could have kept the plutonium mass and the uranium mass, but to turn that into something politically usable would have been very difficult. And we should not forget, if Ukraine had decided to do that, they would have been sanctioned left and right. They would have been isolated. Ukraine received a lot of support, from the West. Basically, they were allowed to integrate into the society of states fairly easily by giving up their nuclear weapons. And they would have been in huge economic trouble had they decided to play any games with the nuclear weapons. And so for them, it was a cost-benefit calculation, right?
Let's say hypothetically that they did have operational nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Do you think Russia still would have gone over their borders and attacked them? Or do you think they would have been too scared to do that?
Probably not. From what we've seen from all other parts of the world where two states, say, for example, maybe it's a Pakistan-India scenario, right? Where you have both sides trying to and cause some trouble in the other state, and you have some skirmishes along the border, and sometimes actually the skirmishes, they expand a bit and it becomes quite violent, but you don't get to the point where you have a general war. So I'm pretty sure that with a proper nuclear capability, this war would not have happened. Not like this.
What do you think is the bottleneck of countries to be able to create those operational nuclear weapons that you're talking about? Like they can get the uranium, the plutonium, but to get that knowledge to be able to make them. Is it because of only certain countries have academic, scientific traditions for actually having a program for teaching this, for learning this, for studying this? And is that knowledge located just certain points in the world where they have that kind of knowledge?
It's an interesting question. So let's go through it step by step, right? So number one is you need the fissile material. So that is either uranium or plutonium. You get uranium by enriching uranium that is found in the earth, and plutonium you get as a byproduct of what happens inside a nuclear reactor. And enriching is more technologically difficult, I would say. Well, no, not true. But both have challenges, but different ones. So, with enriching, you need a lot of centrifuges. And they are very sensitive material. So, for example, I was told a story that when UN inspectors came into Iran at one point, when there were still like serious negotiations about stopping their nuclear program, one of the UN personnel did is they just touched like one of these centrifuges with their hand, because they knew that like the particles on your hand, the dust particles and everything else, that is enough to basically make that centrifuge unusable.
Really?
Because it spins super, super fast. And then like a tiny difference in mass just like destroys it, unusable.
Wow.
So very difficult. But you can get there. And Iran did. I don't, I'm not like an expert on nuclear proliferation. I don't know exactly how they did it, but
you think it's through espionage, like they have spies in different countries that infiltrate the scientific environments, and they get their knowledge and they fly back to Iran, and they...
It doesn't even have to be like secret spying. It's more like, that's what Pakistan did, for example, that the chief engineer of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, he was working at an enrichment facility in the Netherlands, totally legal, right? And actually quite high up. And then when he went back to Pakistan, he took just a bunch of knowledge and materials with him.
Yeah.
And he just used that to further Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. So it's difficult to keep that in check. But then, also... That there's a difference between explicit and tacit knowledge that comes in. So, explicit knowledge is something that you find in a book that's written down. And tacit knowledge is just some things you cannot really write down.
Yeah.
It's just something that has to be conveyed through mentorship and continuous training. And nuclear and missile programs, they fall under that. So that's why it can be difficult, right? Like I know step by step how to produce a nuclear weapon. Wow. I can read that in the internet. That's not easy. Not difficult. But like putting that into practice,
actually doing it.
The steps.
Where do you think that tacit knowledge is located in the world? Is it like in United States, and where is that knowledge actually located?
So every country that produces nuclear weapons. They, of course, have that tacit knowledge. Then a lot of very relevant tacit knowledge is in countries that have a substantial nuclear energy production economy, for example. Because, as I said, like plutonium is derived as a byproduct from nuclear reactors. So if my country has a bunch of nuclear reactors running, then I deal with a lot of plutonium automatically. Like Japan. Perfect example, right? They produce so much plutonium on a yearly basis. And actually, like the IAEA, which is the body that keeps track that Japan doesn't use their plutonium for nefarious purposes. There's actually, there's always an accounting gap where it's just a margin of error where we cannot keep track of material. It's just like natural because we don't have perfect vision insights. So, And Japan produces so much plutonium that the accounting gap is so big that basically Japan could produce one nuclear weapon every year, and we wouldn't realize it, or we wouldn't even suspect anything because that falls within that accounting gap. So Japan has like Japan also has like a space launch industry. I'm pretty sure if they really want to go for it, they can create a nuclear warhead and a nuclear delivery vehicle in the form of maybe not an ICBM, maybe not intercontinental, but a medium or intermediate range ballistic missile. Sure, they can do that. South Korea, the same. Maybe for South Korea, for them would be a bit more difficult to get the nuclear materials, so plutonium or uranium, but they have an excellent missile program, conventional missile program. I mean, for them, it would be very easy to, once they have the warhead, mount that on a ballistic missile that is already existing in their arsenal. Sure, they can do that within weeks, probably.
Let's say in the United States, with the nuclear weapons that they already have, who were the ones actually building them? Where was the knowledge located? Was it like from the civilian sector with Harvard and the scientific environments where they got the research and everything, or was it like fundamentally like Department of Defense within the military that did the whole thing? Do you know?
Yeah, so that is in the United States. They have a bunch of laboratories, and they call them laboratories, national laboratories, where they did like the nuclear weapons research and production.
Were they like civilian laboratories or falling under the military?
I think they're under the Department of Energy, actually.
Yeah, so that's civilian sector.
Would be no, they're like, I mean, way too sensitive for proper. I don't know the exact arrangement, but I don't think they fall under civilian contractors. I'm pretty sure they are. At least, like with all the security clearances and everything you need. I mean,
because I'm trying to get to, was it like, was the nuclear arms race, was it a result of civilian scientists thinking and competing and peer reviewing and getting to that level of knowledge, or was it all done with like within the military and like closed off from the world?
That was state driven. That was
state driven. Yeah.
And then they obviously there were a bunch of individuals who probably thrived under this environment. And it's actually a bit an issue that I heard that, especially in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States, that some of the tacit knowledge has gone lost because people retired. Not a lot of new people came in, right? Like, especially in this post-Cold and Cold War environment, people don't necessarily with an engineering degree. I mean, do you really want to work for like a nuclear weapons laboratory? A lot of people said no. And so that's, by the way, also totally the same with conventional weapons programs. So, like the most advanced fighter jet, the F22 Raptor, was produced around in the early 2000s. And it's 2023, and the United States, they cannot produce the same level of quality in fighter jets right now, just because like the tacit knowledge is lost. Like if they right now, like, I mean, the production stopped a while ago, but if they tried and, they have considered reopening a production line for the F-22. They can't do it.
Really?
They don't have the people anymore.
Wow.
That the knowledge is gone lost. Or like, I mean, they could get it back, but it would take a lot of time.
So actually, retirement is a threat to national security.
Yeah, in some way, totally 100% with Kongsberg, they have the same issue. Really? During my master's degree, I cooperated with MBDA Germany, which is a German missile manufacturer, and they had the same issue. So like one of the mentors I had there who, like taught me a lot and was always willing to, explain things to me. He was basically already retired. It's just he was too valuable. They couldn't let him retire because he had been in this company for like 40 years. He's worked on missile defense, on missile engines, on missile warheads, on missile guidance. And basically, like he's the perfect employee because he has very specific insights into the different components, but also into systems integration. And these are the kinds of people that you need. And you constantly need to make sure that if you're a defense industry, that your industrial environment fosters these kind of people to come over and over.
You have to have these mentorships to be able to transfer this knowledge to the next generation.
And it's a huge challenge for the defense industry right now.
So actually the guys making the ICBMs and the nuclear warheads should make some YouTube videos to be able to transfer their knowledge to the next generation. TikTok videos.
That would be funny. Like, laboratory internal TikTok videos or something. Right?
Got spread everywhere. This is how you make a nuclear warhead.
It's there's a very specific case in the in the British nuclear warhead production program, where it seems a bit funny almost that like the biggest challenge that they had at one point is that they could not reproduce a synthetic foam that's inside the warhead, right? Like there's just like a bit an insulator that works to accelerate the neutron production and the reflection. And I mean, that's, this has nothing to do with like the plutonium or the difficult sensoric in there. No, it's just like a synthetic foam. But also that involves a lot of complicated steps, and they lost the tacit knowledge on that. So yeah, there's a huge issue everywhere. I'm pretty sure it's also an issue in civilian industry, but I know from my experience, I know that the defense industry has struggled with that a lot in the last couple of decades.
It's also interesting. I came to think about like the countries that have nuclear weapons as per 2023. That's like, okay, you have it. We won't get into that. You can just keep them like France and everything. But if a new country like wants to get nuclear weapons, then everybody's like, no, you will be sanctioned. No, you can't. So there's like a distinction there between the ones who already have it. We accept that they have it. We won't like do anything about it. Perhaps we have some. We try to encourage them to have less of it, but we will not accept any new countries having it. Why do you think that? Where does that difference come from?
It's just because, I mean, look at it from the perspective of the United States, right? Like, United States has an unbelievably powerful conventional arsenal that it basically can confront any country in the world rather easily, maybe with the exception of China, where it would be a bit more of a balanced fight. But if you're Iran, if you're Iraq, if you're one of the potential, if you're Syria, I mean, you know that if push comes to shove and the United States brings its full conventional power against you, you will not stand this chance. And then what is the perfect equalizer of that power imbalance? It's nuclear weapons. So that is why countries like Iran, they actually have a huge interest in building up a nuclear arsenal, but also why countries like the United States have a huge interest in preventing countries from proliferating. Because that means that would be a direct challenge, to their influence in the world. And speaking of influence, it doesn't only have to be, in terms of war fighting and defending against an invasion. It's just that, nuclear weapons, they give you a sort of influence, a sort of coercive power, right? Like, I mean, North Korea has, without doubt, some coercive leverage over South Korea, simply because the one is nuclear powered while the other isn't. So that is why I think we generally try to prevent countries from proliferating. And then, of course, sometimes also our allies, right? Think again about the United States. They have a lot of leverage over Japan and South Korea because they kind of depend on their security on the United States. But if they had their own nuclear weapons, things might change. The balance changes. But what about other Western countries? Let's say, hypothetically, Norway declares, we want to build nuclear weapons here in Norway. How would the NATO and EU and the Western world react to that? That would also be absolutely unacceptable. Simply because, it's... I mean, we just have established at this point, probably as a human race, that proliferating is just something you don't do. Unless you have nefarious goals.
But also, what about the deterrence aspect? Like, we do not want any more war with Russia, therefore we will build nuclear weapons to keep them at bay, to keep them at a distance.
I'm probably the United States would forward deploy 2 divisions north of Norway before they would allow you guys to start having your own nuclear weapons. Now, it does not, right? Like, I mean, it would be an interesting case almost. Like, what happens if one of our NATO allies decides it is really determined to acquire a nuclear arsenal? That for sure would bring like some sort of dilemma. And you had that during the Cold War. I mean, Western Germany, for example, for a long time, they were very determined to build up a nuclear arsenal. And it took a lot of convincing from the United States to tell them not to do it, including the threat that we will stop assisting, we will stop providing security assistance, or we will withdraw our troops from Western Germany. So, it was threats of economic sanctions, and it was threats of, well, if you are attacked, you're alone. Your choice.
But what about when France and Great Britain built their nuclear weapons? Was there a lot of dispute and arguing over whether or not they were able to do that and allowed to do it?
It was the same. So the United States was not entirely happy about it. They accepted it. So, in the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, where it's outlined that nuclear proliferation is illegal. There's 5 nuclear weapon states that are legally allowed to have nuclear weapons, and those were the 5 that proliferated first. So United States, Russia as the successor of the Soviet Union, China, France, and the UK. And they are legally allowed to have nuclear weapons. All the others actually are not legally allowed. But the United States was not very happy about it. And they lost, they feared that they would lose influence with their allies. And I think for France and the UK, it was less of a question because both were geographically in a bit different situation, right? Like Germany after World War II immediately in a very, very tense security situation, where basically there was immediately and always a threat that you will be invaded by your eastern neighbor. So you require your immediate assistance from the United States. The UK, with its island position, and France, with a bit more towards Western Germany, towards Western Europe, didn't depend on immediate US assistance outright. And they also, especially in the case of France, it was a stated objective to retain independence from the United States. And that's why we want a nuclear weapons capability. So I guess, bottom line is that it's for all of the countries that have acquired nuclear weapons. It was always a trade-off. And the countries that went through with it, they decided that the potential advantages are greater than the potential drawbacks.
Yeah.
And
Can't you say also that there's also a strength in that several NATO countries actually have nuclear deterrence capabilities?
Yeah, there's, of course. It's, you have different decision-making centers that are capable of independently deciding to employ nuclear weapons. So let's say even in a hypothetical scenario, the United States nuclear arsenal is neutralized for some reason. You still have France, the United Kingdom, that could retaliate on their own. And for Germany, there's a real question, or for Paris and Berlin, is there, let's say, the national survival of Germany is threatened. Is there even an instance where the threat to national survival of Germany does not also constitute a threat of national survival to France? You get into like a blurry area, and then you can say that, no, actually the French arsenal very directly protects Germany as well, because there is almost no instance where Germany could be realistically conquered without there being a massive threat to France. So in that sense, it provides, I would say, a bunch of deterrence advantages to NATO as a nuclear alliance.
Do these countries also have, like France and Britain, do they also have this MAD protocol, this mutual assured destruction that Russia and United States, I think they had, I don't know if they still have that principle of mutual assured destruction?
Yeah, it was just the unspoken truth of the reality. So there was like no agreement or anything. It's just that both sides knew that whoever fires first will also receive some amount of nuclear weapons that are more than enough to destroy everything. Like with France and the UK, they were a bit like China, that they knew that at least for them, it was very clear early on, that they don't have the same resources as the United States or the Soviet Union. So building up a massive nuclear arsenal just was not realistic. So what these countries did is that they focused also on a smaller numbers of very survivable nuclear weapons. That's why both France and the United Kingdom, they primarily rely on their submarine-launched ballistic missiles for delivering their nuclear warheads.
Not so much like the missile silos and
no, they don't even have that. No. It doesn't exist. France also has like an airborne capability, so some bombers that could deliver cruise missiles. But actually, that is basically only a warning shot. So France that's quite interesting. They made, this decision that they thought, at one point we might have to warn the enemy that one more step and we have to press the big red button.
Yeah.
But then, how do you do that? And they said, well, just talking may not be enough. But if we launch one of our ballistic missiles from under the sea, that is picked up by satellites first and then also on the radar, and the enemy sees a ballistic missile coming in. And the adversary, or Russia, seeing that France just launched a ballistic nuclear weapon, they may think this is not just one as a signaling strike. They cannot know that. They might think this is the start of a huge attack. So they may immediately retaliate with everything they have. Mm-hmm. So France said, well, this is not an option. What we need a different type of delivery vehicle to make a distinction, right? So that the one part of our nuclear arsenal is for strategic retaliation, so we destroy you, and the other part is for signaling. Awesome. And so they built a cruise missile that is armed with a nuclear warhead, and basically French doctrine says that before we launch our strategic nuclear arsenal, before we press the big red button, we will fire a warning shot against a militarily significant target. So, for example, against an advancing tank brigade, mm-hmm. and that will serve as a warning shot. So that is your one. Mm-hmm. That is your one chance of stopping and reversing. Otherwise, we will be forced to retaliate in full force.
Aha! Because I saw that French movie, which is called When the Wolves Sing or something, where it's on Netflix about this guy who's a military analyst who uses audio inside a submarine to be able to listen to what's going on. And what happens there, I think, in that movie is that they get that submarine gets an order that France is under attack and that they've been attacked with ICBM, and then the submarine is given orders to retaliate, and then the connection, the dialogue or the communication is lost between the submarine and the president. So they're not able to talk to him and verify. And then they say that no, the doctrine says that if we've given this order, we're going to do this regardless of whether we achieve communications or not. Because then they're in that situation that they don't know if have they been attacked or not. Was it a false positive? Was it a false ICBM? They don't know, but still they have to retaliate because that's the order that's been given. Yeah. They have to complete that. So that's an interesting situation to be in. What do you do if communication is lost and you don't know what happened?
There is a lot of funny anecdotes. It's a bit weird to say, but there are some really interesting stories. So, for example, the British, their orders are that the submarine every morning listens in to the BBC News. Oh. And they basically have the order that if BBC News has been off for so and so many days, you can assume that the United Kingdom has been destroyed.
Really?
Oh. And that may be enough to warrant a nuclear strike.
Wow.
On the French side, I know that every French president, when he gets into office, writes a handwritten letter that is handed out to the commanders of the submarines, which is then also opened, in case a retaliation has to happen. They will also receive that handwritten letter where they have, I don't know, no one knows what's in there. It could be words of encouragement.
Yeah.
Could
you
be
can do it.
sorry for putting you in that position. Yeah. I don't know, but it's
Have a good day.
But it's a huge issue, right? Especially if you have a submarine force. How do you guarantee continuous communication, command and control? That your nuclear weapons, they are launched exactly then when you want to, but they're not launched accidentally.
Yeah,
and that's a really big challenge. And the luxury of submarines is that, in theory, they can circle around the oceans for weeks, if not months. And, even in theory, you can say, even if they don't know immediately, that cannot confirm immediately that an attack has taken place and destroyed their home country, maybe they can infer it after 3 to 4 weeks, and then you still have the threat of retaliation.
Yeah, so that's the real strategic deterrence of actually having submarines, because they are one of the few like vehicles that could actually survive a strategic nuclear attack down there in the ocean, I guess.
I mean, the thing is, the oceans are super vast, right? Like, there can be, I mean, there are a bunch of all different 3D waypoints, right? You can be like more left, more right, but also up and down. So, yeah, sure, I can start firing a crazy amount of nuclear warheads into into the water, and if I'm close enough, it will take out the submarine. But the oceans are so vast;
it's so difficult to say.
Not possible. The United States actually, they are not nuclear submarines. They are not unkillable. So at the end of the Cold War, the United States, they were really, really good at tracking Russian SSBNs. So the SSBN is subsurface ballistic nuclear. So that indicates that it's a submarine that is armed with nuclear weapons. So they were really, really good at tracking SSBNs, because they had like a bunch of listening devices installed everywhere around like the Atlantic. And, sometimes one of these devices would pick up a sound. The US Navy would listen in and immediately send in like helicopters or their own attack submarines or frigates. And they would just track these submarines for weeks. And the Russians or the Soviet Union, they were really paranoid at one point. I don't know if you heard that in the 80s, the Russians, I think it was 83, they shot down this airliner from South Korea that had on board a US congressman, because they assumed actually there was an American strategic bomber that was inbound. And people say one of the reasons why they were so trigger heavy in the moment and so paranoid is because their submarines had been stalked for months by US Navy assets. And they seriously feared that, if push comes to shove, the United States may take out our land-based silos, our nuclear bombers, and perhaps even our submarines. So these things are not invulnerable. And, like if you think about hypothetical case of Iran, like what will Iran do to build up a survivable nuclear arsenal if they decide to proliferate? I would say probably they're not betting on submarines, because, submarines, very complicated technology. Also, to make them really silent, they need to be nuclear propelled, because diesel engines are loud. But then,
that's even more difficult.
No, it's a bit, it's tricky. They can be both, because you can shut off diesel engines completely. Whereas you can't do that with nuclear engines. Obviously. Like in nuclear, the chain reaction needs to go on forever. If it stops, and then you're stuck, which is really bad, I guess, if you're a submarine. But like a diesel engine, you can shut off, and then you're like completely silent, right? So it has also like real benefits. And Germans are really good at making diesel engines for the cars, but that's also translated into military equipment. So they made also really silent diesel engines. But let's say you're Iran, you don't have access to really sophisticated A, nuclear technology, or B, German diesel engines. I'm pretty sure that your nuclear submarines, if you put them somewhere into the Mediterranean or in the Persian Gulf, my God, like the US will have the easiest time of tracking them. Like no chance they're survivable. So what I would do if I was Russian, I would get like mobile missile launchers. They can like quickly drive from A to B. Shoot and scoot, we call that. So you shoot and then you run away. That was probably the best, the most survivable way for Iran to get that.
Let's talk more about that. Do a quick break.
Sure.
Make some more coffee. If you can explain to people, how does actually a nuclear warhead work? What happens when a nuclear warhead is ignited and explodes?
So you got two basic designs for a nuclear warhead. The one is the simpler one is the so-called gun type device, where you have. Let's get a bit back. So, what's the basic functioning of a nuclear warhead? What you need is, you always need a critical mass of either plutonium or uranium. And the key challenge is to get a subcritical mass to become critical in the moment that you want to, right? And you can do that in different ways. And the easiest one, and that is the gun type device, is you have two subcritical masses and you put them together in the right moment. The two subcritical masses together become a critical mass and explosion happens. And that is achieved by, well, you have one subcritical mass at the one side of the weapon, you have a subcritical mass on the other side of the weapon, then behind one of the subcritical masses, they are connected by a tunnel, and at the one side, behind the one subcritical mass, you have a conventional explosion. That conventional explosion goes off. The one subcritical mass is launched at the other one. They bump together, critical mass emerges, explosion happens.
Mm-hmm.
That works, and it's very easy. And actually, the Hiroshima weapon was a gun-type device.
Uh-huh.
And the engineers of that program, they were so certain that this will work that they didn't even test it.
Ah.
So they did not test that kind of device
Mm-hmm.
because it's so bulletproof and it's so easy. So you see a lot of emerging nuclear weapon states, nascent nuclear weapon states. The first nuclear weapon that they built is a gun-type device, just because it's so easy. And we talked earlier about South Africa and how their nuclear program wasn't that sophisticated. Actually, they only had, like a couple of crude gun-type device weapons, like a handful. So that is the one. And the thing is, why states move away from that is because it's fairly inefficient, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you have, these two subcritical masses, they are pushed towards each other, but then the moment the explosion happens, as you can imagine, the masses are pushed away from each other again.
Mm-hmm.
And there's still enough time, like a couple of milliseconds to create a massive explosion, but a lot of energy is just lost in the process.
Mm-hmm.
So you need a huge bunch of uranium, let's say like around 50 kilograms of uranium, 225 kilogram blocks essentially. And that takes a lot of time to get that. And it's just not very energy efficient. So the yield that you will get from that type of device is not proportionate to the effort that it takes, to build that.
And also, as a side note, are there
Yeah.
only certain specific places in the world where you actually get uranium?
Yeah.
Is
Sure.
that like, do we have that in Europe, or do you have to go? Do you know where they are?
Actually, the largest, or the uranium deposit that the Soviet Union used for most of its weapon systems was in Eastern Germany.
Mm.
In fact, I also just learned that a couple months ago. I also wasn't aware of that. But yeah, they're all over the world, and there are a couple of them in Europe. I think the largest ones are some of the largest ones are in Canada and in Kazakhstan, I think, as well.
Mm-hmm.
But don't quote me on that. I don't know for sure. But it's not like we're running out of the material,
Yeah.
right? Like it can be a bit of hassle getting to it, but there's enough companies who are specialized in uranium mining.
Is uranium the only raw material used to build a nuclear weapon? Could you use
No.
other types of radioactive materials?
Yeah, as I said, like plutonium is
Yeah.
the other one.
Mhm.
I'll get to that in a second for the second type of device.
And
But then,
thorium?
you get like other sorts of material where it would theoretically be possible, but it would just be a lot more difficult. I don't know the exact reasons anymore. I read about that at one point, and like there are reasons why we can only use uranium and plutonium realistically.
Yeah.
There is, so for example, like they tried, in the nuclear energy process, they have tried to change uranium for other radioactive products in order to prevent the creation of plutonium,
I see.
to make them more proliferation proof. But again, like I don't know too much about that. But there are other radioactive materials, but they're not necessarily suitable.
But the countries that actually have uranium in their country, they are perhaps in a very powerful position that they have that and be able to use that or sell that to other countries. And is that like a power dynamic, the states that actually have those kinds of materials?
It's more the technology. Actually, like there's this idea of center-periphery relations. It's like a very prevailing theory in international relations that you always have a center that exploits the periphery. I mean, we still have that today, right? That like Europe as a bit of like the northern hemisphere as the center exploiting the south, Russia as the center exploiting like the states around it. Soviet Union was also a prime example of that. And yeah, it's a bit, like the center holds the technology. I mean, France is like huge on nuclear technology. And they import like these raw materials from like poorer countries, and conditions are often bad, and there's a lot of violence involved. So it's I would say mining practice are probably not known as the most mining industry is not known as the most ethical industry out there, and it's not different for uranium. So that's the thing. Like the gun type device based on uranium, pretty easy to make, but not very efficient. So to get a more efficient nuclear warhead, you need an implosion device. So, basically, I mean, if you want to make a subcritical mass into a critical mass, what happens is that you need to increase the neutron capture rate, right? Like you have the way, right? Like a chain reaction happens. Everyone has heard of that like nuclear explosions, they're based on chain reactions. It's like by neutrons that are flying around, they are capturing other isotopes, uranium isotopes, and by being captured by the isotope splits, and that creates energy. It's a minuscule amount of energy, but if that happens trillions and trillions of times, that's how you get a huge explosion. So what you need to do is you need to increase the neutron capture rate. And then like the one way of doing that is by just, providing more isotopes. Like you create a bigger mass, so more that neutrons have a higher chance of just like capturing an isotope. The other way is you increase the density, right? Like the closer I push my isotopes together, the higher the neutron capture rate. So, and that is done with plutonium. You basically have a plutonium core, you call it, which in the beginning, it was just like, basically like a bowling ball, I don't know, they call it that, right? Basically that, just like a big ball of plutonium. And around that, you had conventional explosives. And you need to make sure that these conventional explosives, they go off in a perfectly timed manner to perfectly compress that ball into a smaller ball. And that's how you increase the density, you increase the neutron capture rate, and that's how you get your critical mass. So that's how a subcritical mass that you can hold in your hand without any problem becomes this huge fireball. And in the beginning, they just used like a ball, but at one point they realized if we actually use a hollow sphere, so it's like a hollowed out ball, then we can compress it further. Makes sense, right? Like that's how most nuclear weapons nowadays, they're just like basically hollow plutonium spheres that are then compressed together into a small ball that then explodes. And that is a much more efficient process. So a smaller amount of plutonium, so like let's say 7 to 9 kilograms, can create a huge explosion. But it's more complicated because, as I just said, you need to explode conventional explosives around the hollow sphere perfectly, because if they are not perfectly timed and all explode at the same time, your sphere is not being compressed into a perfect little ball. It just, it just explodes apart basically because you apply more pressure on one side than on the other. And that is you can imagine, right? Like this is an extremely rapid process. And so even tiny milliseconds of delay, like thousands or millions of seconds, they can completely bust your nuclear explosion. And that's why first countries often start with a gun type device, and then once they have mastered that and want to move away from that, then they can go on to the implosion device. This being said, with more advanced technology being more available, easier, probably nowadays, like it was much more of a challenge to create an explosion device in the 60s than it is nowadays. So, comparatively speaking, Iran would have a much easier time immediately going to an implosion device than than China, the Soviet Union, or the United States had. So yeah.
So those large ICBM devices, are they mostly implosion devices, do you think, with plutonium?
Yeah, so, and that's like how we get to the third type, and this is what, especially in strategic nuclear warheads, the term hydrogen bomb or fusion bomb, that is where you use the initial explosion of an implosion device, that is your primer, and that energy is used to fuse deuterium and deuterite and something else. So you just you fuse certain elements, isotopes, to create a new one, and that creates even more energy.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that you can repeat the process over and over again. So you can have a primer exploding a secondary device. The secondary device creates new energy to implode another device, which then creates more energy for even more fusion.
Wow.
And that's how you get insane types of megaton explosions.
Wow.
Usually not necessary. So for all the nuclear warheads that now exist, they are all based, what we know from public records, and obviously I don't have access to classified information, but they are all based on just, one primer, one fusion.
Yeah.
And that creates anything between 100 to several megatons.
But those hydrogen bombs, those extremely a million tons TNT, have they ever been tested and fired?
Yeah.
Yeah, they have.
Many times tested, yeah. Yeah, biggest nuclear explosion ever was the Tsar bomba.
Yeah.
50 megatons.
That's crazy.
And the fun fact here is that Soviet decision makers, they demanded a 100 megaton explosion, and the scientists were afraid that the atmosphere, the oxygen in the atmosphere would ignite and basically burn the whole world.
Holy shit.
So they scaled it down.
Yeah, good choice. Good call.
They were just, but that was actually the same fear. The first nuclear explosion ever, Project Trinity, in 1945.
Yeah.
They also feared that the oxygen would ignite. They just didn't know what would happen. It was a risk. Some scientists were really concerned about that. Others were saying, no, there's no risk. But in the end, no one, there was a bit of debate out there. Probably people were pretty certain that we're not all going to burn down in a horrific fire. But there were scientists who were genuinely concerned that this is a risk of what we're doing here.
Wow, that is so crazy to be able to think about that. Do we actually have 100 megaton weapons in somebody's arsenal?
No.
What's the biggest one that's known that's in some country's arsenal?
I would have to look it up, but I think the standard strategic nuclear warhead for the United States on an ICBM silo, the W88 warhead, I think that's between 200 and 300 kilotons.
Yeah.
And it might be, I would have to look it up, might be that the United States has some megaton warheads on its submarines. But if it does so, then there would be the lower, so 1 to 2, 1 to 3, something like that. And I think it's the same for Russia. So
because that's interesting. As a follow-up question to that, is there a lot of transparency with regards to the nuclear arsenals of the world, or do you think there's still a lot of secrecy and lots of classified stuff that they actually have far more advanced weapons than they say they have?
No, I would say on the nuclear side, it's fairly transparent, especially where treaties are involved. So between Russia and the United States, up until now, they had very clear-cut treaty obligations. So I don't know if they had to tell the yield of the nuclear warhead. I don't think they had to, but it's a very open secret, what warhead is on which type of nuclear weapon. At least for for Russia and the United States. With China, it becomes a bit more secretive. That they're not as open and not as willing to talk about it, simply because they have a lower overall number of warheads. So they rely on this ambiguity to some extent for their deterrence power. I think with North Korea, we don't really know what scale, what explosive power they can reach their nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they can also build megaton warheads, because once you master the implosion device, and actually we have pictures, of Kim Jong-un standing next to a warhead device that looks exactly like or very similar to an American thermonuclear warhead. So that's why we can basically infer, okay, they also have mastered a thermonuclear device.
Can you explain thermonuclear?
Sorry, that's the same as a fusion device, or basically like when you have a primary warhead, the primary device, which sets off the fusion. That's a thermonuclear.
The second type of device that you were explaining of the three kinds.
Yeah, exactly. No, like that's the third kind.
The third kind. Yeah.
So when you have a fusion device, a fission, like the gun type and the implosion, what they do, they create fission. Because fission is like when isotopes split.
Fission,
so that is where the energy comes from in like the implosion and the gun type device. And then fusion, that is where isotopes fuse to create new isotopes. Or I don't actually know. I don't know.
But is that always the same as a hydrogen bomb, or is that something completely separate?
So it's called hydrogen bomb because hydrogen or thermonuclear, they're the same.
Okay.
Fusion, hydrogen, thermonuclear. I used like all different terminology. It was my bad.
Just different words.
It's called hydrogen bomb because hydrogen is like one of the isotopes or atoms that's either created or used in that kind of device. I actually don't know. I would have to look it up exactly. But that's why we call them hydrogen bombs.
But also transparency is also, it seems like a bit of point for having like deterrence also to be able to tell the world what you actually have in your arms stock. It's
a trade-off, right? And it depends exactly on the country we're talking about, because for the United States, I would say it makes sense to tell the world how mighty its nuclear arsenal is. But then for a country with a small nuclear arsenal, it would be actually quite risky to be transparent about what kind of weapons I have, because that makes calculations for the adversary more easy. And
also, why did the US allow, in citation marks, North Korea to be able to develop nuclear weapons when it doesn't kind of allow Iran to be able to do that? Is there a difference there?
I mean, in many ways, they're kind of similar, because we also sanctioned North Korea heavily. I mean, North Korea is still sanctioned for its nuclear program. And, officially our policy goal is still to reverse North Korean proliferation. Which is vastly unrealistic in my opinion, but it's still our goal. And it's the same with Iran, right? That we've sanctioned them heavily, and we lifted our sanctions once they were in compliance with the Iran nuclear deal. We sanctioned them again once they stopped complying. And what it comes down to, at one point, you either have to apply conventional force or you allow the country to proliferate. If the country is determined. That's the thing with Iran. Or if North Korea was extremely determined to proliferate. We know that now.
They didn't care about the sanctions.
No, but at one point we hoped, we felt like, hey, maybe they actually care, because there were times where they were in compliance with the obligations, and then they went back on them. It was a bit of back and forth. But the one thing, we know that now, the one thing that could have stopped North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons is probably invading the country. Or an extremely comprehensive air campaign directed at the nuclear facilities, which would have been very difficult. So I think the most likely successful scenario would have been a full-scale invasion. I mean, probably if you ask some American decision makers today what they would prefer, either a costly war against North Korea in the 90s or the situation we're in right now, I'm pretty sure some would say, no, we should have invaded. And, if Iran is determined to proliferate, and I mean, I don't know if it is. Iran is not the area of expertise, the area where I'm looking at, spend my time on. But if they are determined to proliferate, it will come down to, will the United States and potentially other countries, are they willing to use conventional force to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear arsenal.
And also they could use Cyberforce, because I remember watching the documentary about the Stuxnet virus that they sent, which went straight, which was like a kind of a worm or a virus, which went straight to the, what do you call this, spinning?
The centrifuges.
The centrifuges, and took them out. And it was probably developed by the United States and Israel.
Super fascinating.
Yeah.
You know how they got it into the facility?
No.
I mean, we don't know, but we suspect that they basically, someone dropped an USB on the parking lot. Yeah. Wow. And people are actually stupid enough then to pick that up and plug it into there. But it was a so-called air-gapped network, so you cannot infiltrate it via the World Wide Web.
Yeah.
You actually have to physically insert the virus or the nefarious software into the network.
Yeah, it seems so stupid. A USB. Let's put this one in and see what's on there.
So, but we assume that's how they got it in, which is really funny. But what it did was, it delayed it.
Yeah,
I actually did. So it was, I think, the most successful cyber operation in history, probably, because it's one of the very few examples where you can see how a digital effect translates into a kinetic one in the real physical world. Yeah. So that's very impressive. But I mean, then again, all it did was kind of delay Iran.
Yeah.
Right now, they're at the point where they could, within a couple of weeks, they could create the material for a nuclear device.
Wow, right now.
Yeah.
What do you think that the consequences of that will be politically from the United States, NATO, EU? What will happen then if they actually say that, hey, we have nuclear weapons now? What's up?
Not a lot, I think. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a couple, there's really interesting research out there on, how the international behavior of states changes once they acquire nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And some become a bit more aggressive. Some are a bit more bolstering, they're a bit more assertive. Mm-hmm. If you look at France, they were suddenly, they were willing to be more independent. Yeah. So there are behavior changes, and the same would happen to Iran.
Yeah.
But in the big picture, Iran would not suddenly become a major power that everyone would have to listen to.
No.
We would probably, there would be some kind of balance emerging between Israel and Iran.
Yeah.
And as always, in these situations, the first years are the riskiest ones.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say within a decade, you would probably get to a very stable nuclear deterrence situation.
Mm-hmm. What do you think will be the reaction from the US or the West if they said that they now have nuclear weapons?
So the biggest thing that might happen from a US perspective is that you get a bit of a proliferation wave in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Because Iran has, Saudi Arabia has indicated very heavily that if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon capability, Saudi Arabia would have to do that as well. And then you become, and that's a bit a tricky situation for the United States, because Saudi Arabia is a clear ally, but as I outlined earlier, the United States and other nuclear weapon states, they also don't really have an interest in their allies proliferating. Mm-hmm. So, what you're going to do then? Then probably the next goal is to stop this proliferation wave. And that somehow means that we have to reassure Saudi Arabia, which could mean that the United States deploys more troops, more missile defense to Saudi Arabia. Israel would certainly react in some way. It could be that I don't think they would then suddenly start being more transparent about their own nuclear capabilities, but that they could take very visible steps towards acquiring a stronger arsenal or building up, more conventional weapons that could be used to destroy the North Korean nuclear arsenal in case of an emergency. That's what South Korea does, right? South Korea, they have and that's really interesting. South Korea so far is the only country in the world that has a conventional arsenal that is explicitly aimed at countering a nuclear arsenal.
Really?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Because for South Korea, they have made the decision so far that now proliferating is an option, but it would be too costly. It would be too risky because we could use support from the United States. We could incur sanctions. Mm-hmm. They're actually really realistic about that. And I think that's also a bit what's special about South Korea is that they
they have a real debate inside their country. What does it mean to proliferate? Probably a debate that you don't see in any other country. I mean, Japan also sometimes, like flirts with the idea. Or like in Germany, like this idea comes up every couple of years. Like whether with the United States withdrawing from Europe, Germany has to think about a European nuclear deterrent. But there's like no real discussion about the repercussions and what that means. In South Korea, they do that. So they know for sure we will be sanctioned, we will lose US support. Yeah. But maybe there is the point where we have to accept that. And I think, they under certain circumstances, they would be totally willing to proliferate. But so far, and that is, for example, where my research really comes in, at this intersection of conventional missile technology and nuclear strategy, South Korea has made a very clear strategic decision that right now we intend to counter the North Korean nuclear arsenal with our conventional arsenal. And they've built up a bunch of conventional weapon systems that are specifically tasked with that purpose and also constructed in a way to achieve that objective.
Mm-hmm. So I was thinking about getting into that subject of defense against nuclear missiles. Now, is that a kind of defense in South Korea towards the missiles when they're on the ground, non-operational? Or is this defense when they're actually in the air, inbound for South Korea, like to take them out in flight?
Yeah. So South Korea's nuclear strategy relies on three elements. Mm-hmm. The first is punishment, which is punishment directed against the regime. So South Korea says that if you intend to employ nuclear weapons, we will take out Kim Jong-un and his entourage. Mm-hmm. So like that's direct punishment against the decision makers. Mm-hmm. And then it's denial. And there are two types of denial. The one is denial through counterforce, we call it. So here's the idea: we take out the nuclear weapons before they are launched. Yeah. So that is, for example, South Korea deploys a bunch of conventional cruise and ballistic missiles that are armed with, or the cruise missile, for example, they're armed with penetrator warheads that can penetrate very deep into bunker structures or mountains. And the idea is that, we take out your mobile missile launchers before you have a chance to launch them. And South Korea is aware that, we will probably not get all of them. Mm. So that's where the third part of the strategy comes in, and that is missile defense. And, I and a lot of my colleagues probably would have said that missile defense, not very effective. There was always this idea that, it comes down to hitting a bullet with a bullet because of the speed involved. And what we see in Ukraine, Western missile defense is insane.
Yeah.
It's so effective.
Yeah.
So like right now I'm like, holy shit, they could do it, Like if they can actually destroy a large enough part of North Korea's nuclear arsenal.
Yeah.
And again, pure speculation. We don't know how much it actually is.
Yeah.
And all they have to do is destroy the remnants of what's left of that arsenal. We've seen the Patriots around Kiev take down Russia's short-range ballistic missiles one by one every night.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen a single piece of credible evidence that a Russian short-range ballistic missile exploded anywhere close to where it was supposed to.
It's amazing.
It's absolutely incredible. And so, now I'm thinking maybe South Korea could actually do it. And, importantly, it would be a bit more complex because not everything would be short-range ballistic missiles. And it would also be medium-range ballistic missiles. And the thing here is they go higher up and then also come down a bit faster. So it's more challenging. But the thing is, what we see in Ukraine, there's a proof of concept that missile defense against shorter-range ballistic missiles is absolutely feasible. Absolutely feasible.
Because the Patriot system also took out the hypersonic missile, the Kinzhal.
That is the short-range ballistic missile. That's a whole different story. It's like, Russia, they always hyped up, they hype up all their equipment, also their missiles. And the Kinzhal hypersonic, in quotation marks, ballistic missile, it's nothing else other than one of their short-range ballistic missiles that they launched from the ground that they put under a plane and just launched from the air.
Oh, really?
And the thing is, with ballistic missiles, when they come down, or at one point during their descent, they reach hypersonic speed.
Yeah.
But there's nothing special, right? Like we had that in the 60s, in the 50s. My God, this is really not anything incredible.
So I've heard so much talk about that, and I picture like, wow, it's like a strategic ICBM missile that's hypersonic, like 10 times the speed of sound, which can go from like Russia to Washington in like 5 minutes, and like that's what you picture in your mind when you hear that.
Yeah, that is because the Western media, they were very happy to pick up, the Russia's hype. And loved their big headlines, basically. But all the people working in the field, myself included, we've been screaming for years that like the Kinzhal hypersonic missile, it's just a ballistic missile that they put under a plane and launched from the air. There's nothing special about it.
So Russia doesn't really have super advanced technology, super advanced missiles.
No, I don't think so. I mean, we haven't seen actually. So they have like one of their super weapons that they haven't used yet is the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle. And the thing is, with a glide vehicle compared to a ballistic missile warhead, a glide vehicle, it glides through the atmosphere on its descent and it can skip. And that makes the re-entry of the warhead a bit more unpredictable. And it can also go a bit left and right. Ballistic missile warheads, they can do that to some extent as well. They might have some extra small rocket engines installed that allow them to navigate a bit left and right, back and forth during the descent. Also for terminal guidance to create accuracy. But so the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle, that is like the last of their so-called super weapons that they haven't used yet. And basically, that's the only super weapon that is left where it still has like some of this aura of fear, because everything else, like the Kinzhal, it's like, my God, that was terrible. Yeah. It's like pathetic almost. Yeah. It's wild how everyone overestimated Russia's equipment, myself included, and everyone underestimated Western equipment, myself included.
It's almost like it would have been better off if they just had kept that in the closet and just talked
100%.
about it, not use it.
100%. I'm also 100% sure that if Putin could go back in time, he would never invade again.
Yeah.
Never.
But that gliding missile that you're talking about, is that for conventional warheads or for nuclear warheads?
For both, apparently.
For both, okay.
So actually, I was thinking that at one point, Russia might deploy that in order to destroy the Patriot. So when I heard that Western countries were sending advanced missile defense assets to Ukraine, I thought that if we will see avant-garde, so the glide vehicle in this conflict, it's when these weapon systems arrive. I mean, one of the reasons, the best one I can imagine why it's not being used, is that Russian decision makers know it's probably not as good as we told the world. And this is like the last piece of equipment.
Talking it up and then...
Yeah, exactly. The same with the Kinzhal, right? Everyone knows it's a joke. Well, not everyone. I mean, some people... I get in heated Twitter debates with people. Because, in my field, if you say anything that indicates that missile defense could work, that is a big no-no. Because missile defense is inherently destabilizing in nuclear strategy. It's a bit paradox because, we think like, well, how can something that is defensive be destabilizing? But the idea behind it is that, if I'm Russia and I'm very afraid that the United States can take out a large part of my nuclear arsenal, then I need to be sure that, whatever is left of that nuclear arsenal, I can use that to retaliate. But if we have effective missile defense, like that is put into question. And a lot of people say, and I think that's true, that one of the biggest achievement of people like me around 50, 60 years ago who worked in that field and who did research, one of the biggest achievement of that generation was to convince decision makers that missile defense is destabilizing. Because, back then, missile defense was very ineffective. It was too complex for the technology that they had available back in the days. So it was not really a realistic endeavor. Not at all. But some, politicians, Reagan, for example, he always hyped up like the Star Wars project. So like people, they try to keep hyping up like missile defense. It could be a realistic option. And now actually the key contribution of these scholars and researchers was to convince even the most heavy defenders of missile defense that no, actually it's counterproductive. And that's how we got to like a treaty that actually limits the amount of missile defenses that states can deploy.
I see.
And the thing is, I still think like in a big picture, missile defense is destabilizing, right? Like it really is.
Yeah, I get it, because it's like building up like, you have this, and then I must have this, and we build higher and higher
exactly.
and higher.
It creates arms race pressures. The one builds up defenses, so the other one is forced to create more offensive weapons. So it's, in that sense, it is really destabilizing. But there is like, I feel like in my field, especially, with the older generation now, and like this typical generation or type of person, like the so-called arms controllers, that are really like, all they did in their career was like push for more arms control. And they did a lot of really good work, but I feel like right now is not the time to talk about arms control. Like, sorry, but it's a thing of the past at this point in time. And B, it doesn't matter, like if you're like, you can either accept the reality or not, but it's here. And what we see in Russia, in Ukraine, is that missile defense has become a lot more effective than in the past. And not saying, that like intercontinental ballistic missile defense is possible, because, that's where we get back to this idea that the longer the range of a ballistic missile, the higher it gets and the faster it comes down. So that's why you cannot extrapolate from the success of short-range missile defense,
Patriot systems,
in Ukraine. You cannot make the argument that, intercontinental ballistic missile defense will be possible. We don't know.
But do we have any systems that we know that are actually meant for defending against that?
Yeah, we have that.
Is it the United States that have that, or
the United States has that. Actually, it's the only one that's deploying a serious capability in it.
And is that transparent? Have they told about like the details around that?
Yeah, we know how many they deploy. We know that that's the thing. We know that it's effective to some extent, but only under very sterilized conditions. So when they test these kind of weapon systems, they found out, for example, that against one incoming ICBM warhead, we need to shoot up 3 interceptors, and we get a probability of interception that approaches 99%.
Okay.
So, but that is under extremely sterilized, perfect test conditions.
Yeah.
In a real world scenario, you don't have one target on your radar. You have hundreds. Some of them will be decoys. Some of them will be real ones. There's a lot of clutter. There's a lot of panic in the decision-making room. It's just not the real thing, right? So that's why I'd say you cannot extrapolate automatically from short-range defense to intercontinental ballistic missile defense.
And also,
and that's the thing, you also cannot ignore it. Like, you cannot tell me that Russian decision makers or Chinese decision makers, they look at Ukraine and they see one Russian ballistic missile intercepted after another, not scoring a single hit, and they will not wonder what that means for their nuclear arsenal. And as some people in my field, they want to tell me, no, Russia is still perfectly confident in its nuclear arsenal, and this has no implications. And I don't buy it. I don't. That's what really I think. Like, this is the reality. Missile defense has become more effective. I don't know how effective. No one knows. But that is a fact. And we can either choose to ignore it or accept it, but it's here either way.
And I've also heard that some ICBMs, like when they launch and then mid-flight, they open up and then they spread out to like 10 or 15 warheads out of that one, which just makes it impossible almost, I guess, like theoretically to take them out, or at least even more difficult. So, but the United States is the only country that has that kind of like ICBM defense.
As far as I know,
yeah.
I mean, Nah, the thing is, officially, Russia deploys systems in that regard. China is working on them.
Yeah.
But an operational capability, I would say, United States is the only one.
What about Europe and Ukraine? And would that what do you think about us having it here in Europe, that kind of system against Russia?
I mean, I would be a huge investment, right? I don't think it's worth it. And again, that would be destabilizing.
Yeah.
That would entice Russia to rearm, and we don't know, how well it actually works. The thing is, I mean, we definitely need more missile defense in Europe, but I think our missile defense should be geared towards a conventional war.
Yeah.
So, the thing is that the nice thing for Ukraine is that they could create a very dense air defense bubble around Kiev.
Yeah.
Because for some stupid reasons that only Putin and Russia knows, they decided to concentrate almost their entire missile force against useless civilian targets in and around Kiev. It's terrible from a moralistic standpoint, but you can almost be happy from a military standpoint.
Yeah.
Because imagine all these thousands of missiles, they had attempted to destroy high-value military assets, even just engage frontline troops to force a breakthrough. I mean, there's so many better things they could have done. And luckily for us, in some sense, they didn't. And again, it's still absolutely awful for the civilians who suffer. But from a military perspective, what Russia is doing makes absolutely no sense. This has allowed Kiev to deploy an extremely dense air defense bubble around the city. So their air defense is very effective.
Is that mainly Patriot systems, or are there different systems?
All sorts of systems. So you have the Patriot, which is there for ballistic missile defense. You have the German IRIS-T SLM, which is a short to medium range system against cruise and drone missile threats. You got the NASAMS, which is produced by Raytheon and Kongsberg, so American Norwegian, which is deployed in and around the city. And then you have a bunch of self-propelled anti-aircraft guns. I'm not sure if you've seen there's this anti-aircraft tank, the Gepard, which was a German tank during the Cold War, which was put out of service a couple years ago because they said it's not effective on the modern battlefield anymore. And right now it does crazy well in Ukraine. So they have a bunch of different systems and they all work very effectively. And one thing they do very well, and it's also something I would not have expected, is that if you have such different air defense systems against such a diverse range of threats, these systems, they need to communicate with each other and they need to prioritize different targets. So it's not cost effective for a Patriot interceptor, which costs several million euros or dollars, to engage a drone that only costs a couple $1,000s. So you need to make sure that your Patriots actually only intercept the high-value targets like short-range ballistic missiles. So there needs to be some communication between the different systems who engages what target. And it appears to do that incredibly well. Something I would not have expected, for example, that this works so well as it apparently does. Because it seems to be working that IRIS-T and NASAMS, they mainly go for the cruise missiles and any drones that slip through. Whereas the cheaper systems, like anti-aircraft guns, they try to take down the drones, the really cheap ones. So it's an incredibly effective, outstanding air defense bubble that has been established.
And one argument that you could say for these kinds of systems, in that they're not as escalating as missile system, is that they're only meant for defensive use. If you don't fire a missile at me, we won't do anything because these are only meant for defending against your missiles. So it's not as escalating as building up other kinds of military hardware.
Well, that's what we would say right now from our perspective in 2023. Super stupid, but in the early 2000s, when Germany, when they commissioned their latest generation of frigates, they decided for some reason that air defense missiles would be too escalatory. So we're not putting them on our ships. So it's just, it's
sitting duck.
It's crazy, like what people were thinking back in those days from a 2023 perspective.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right in principle. You know, like they are less escalatory. Honestly, I don't think we should care about that right now. And I actually have an op-ed coming out either today or on Monday in a German newspaper where I make the argument that Germany needs to build up missile defense.
Yeah.
But because there will be gaps in the air defense bubble around Europe, just, because Europe is not Kiev, where we can concentrate everything on a small spot. No, European states, Germany and other ones, they need the ability to take out enemy missiles before they're launched.
Yeah.
And that implies that you have your own long-range strike capability.
I've heard that NATO actually has those kinds of anti-missile defenses placed different places around Europe.
Yeah.
Like systems connected to each other.
They do, yeah.
Yeah. But do you know in which countries they are? Is that transparent, like where they are placed? Are they in Norway, for example?
I know there's a bunch. I don't think there's any in Norway. There is. I wrote a piece about that like ages ago during my studies. So there was a huge issue about whether we should deploy air defense capabilities to Poland because it was seen as very escalatory from the Russian side.
Yeah.
I think there are some deployed in Romania. I know that there are naval assets deployed around Spain in the Mediterranean Sea. So, that's basically anti or missile defense capabilities that are deployed on ships. That would, for example, protect against the Iranian ballistic missiles. But yeah, they're all around. I mean, in Germany, you have a bunch of Patriots from the United States. We have not further forward deployed them because of concerns regarding Russia prior to the war. Now there's also a bunch of air and missile defense in the Baltic states. Germany, of course, has placed several Patriot batteries to Poland and one in Slovakia. But that was after the war. So that is basically to protect NATO territory from Russian missiles that could accidentally fly into
I see.
NATO territory.
And also lately we had a visit from a big US ship called USS Gerald Fjord into the fjords of Oslo here. What do you think about the symbolic power of that happening?
It's really funny. Like, it's like from a Russian perspective, it's like basically they moved from taking Kiev in 3 days to USS Gerald Fjord in Norwegian in Oslo Fjord, which is like crazy, right? Like they really thought they could steamroll Ukraine, and what they got is being bogged down in Ukraine completely, while giving NATO the greatest boost in terms of its alliance coherence that it could have gotten. That would. I mean, do you think that would have been possible like 5 years ago? No, right? No. And now it was just like, everyone was like, cool. I want to take a picture of that.
Yeah. Creating lots of car chaos everywhere because everybody stops and takes pictures of it.
So this is wild.
What do you think that means that they're sending it here? What do you think they want to communicate?
It's just posturing. So we are willing to defend, every inch of NATO territory, and NATO believes to prove that or make that credible to potential adversaries, we also have to rotate our troops into the different member states once in a while. And so now I was just like, I mean, this aircraft carrier did not just come, to visit Oslo. It was as part of a very large military exercise that was taking place. But surely, I mean, this stopover was not necessary from a logistical point of view.
So an aircraft carrier probably has a lot of political and symbolic value.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And while we're on that subject, an aircraft carrier has a lot of planes, specifically military fighter jets.
Yeah.
And that's also been a big question with regards to our support for Ukraine, whether or not we should give them F-16s and these kinds of things. Because if we fast forward backwards, then we'll see that in the start we were like, no, we won't give them tanks, but okay, we give them tanks as well. And no, we won't give them, at least we won't give them fighter jets, but let's give them some fighter jets. Like we're almost, what do you think about that situations, and what happens with the dynamics of the situation if we actually give them F-16s?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anything happens, like Russia has escalated itself into a corner in the sense that it cannot do more it's already doing since at least September or October last year. That is when Russia started its large-scale missile campaign against civilian targets. That was like the last big step of escalation, that they had available. And there's nothing they can do other than to escalate to the nuclear level, but that's what we discussed at length.
Yeah.
That's not realistic, in my opinion. So yeah, nothing will happen. And it's, I'm glad we're sending them finally, but...
Will that be a major breakthrough for Ukraine to have that kind of air power?
There's no such thing as a, wonder weapon. No. That doesn't exist. But like what the F-16 does, what is most important about it is that it's a platform to carry more Western weapon systems. So it's not necessarily about the F-16 itself, but it's about the kinds of missiles and bombs that it can carry. So for example, you've got the AIM-20 AMRAAM, which is an extended range air-to-air missile, which can shoot over 100 kilometers. That's a capability that Ukraine right now doesn't have. So that provides some sort of impunity to Russian aircraft. Although that also has been somewhat neutralized by the fact that Ukraine already deploys more effective ground-based air defense. But it will just, it will just make things a lot more difficult for Russia. And this is not, F-16 will not turn the war. No. I mean, in the end, this war was turned 2 weeks into the invasion, like when it was clear that Russia cannot achieve its political objectives. The question right now is, how long does it take Ukraine to kick out the Russians, or for the Russians to give up?
But why do you think the Ukraine is requesting specifically the F-16 plane? Why not like F-35 or F-22? Is that just because it's unrealistic that they will get those planes because they're too expensive? Or is it like specifically the air power of the F-16 in that situation?
I mean, Ukraine decision makers, they've asked for F-35s, but they don't get them.
No.
There's also, it's been a bit of thing, that like Western states have been very hesitant to send their most modern equipment. Again, because they were afraid of escalation. But then it's a bit also the same with, the tank debate. The Leopard 2 was just a natural choice because there is the largest arsenals, the largest potential reserves of this kind of equipment in Europe. And that's the same with the F-16. So the F-16 is the Leopard 2 of fighter jets.
Yeah.
There's just the largest stockpile that could theoretically be made available to Ukraine. So it is the natural choice.
Yeah.
And but then also, because unlike a tank, a tank is a weapon in itself. A fighter jet is mostly a platform. And, given that it's a platform for other weapon systems, the availability of these other weapon systems becomes all the more important. And here, the thing is that Western countries, they have a huge shortage of munitions, all sorts of munitions. And that also applies to those types of munitions that would go under a fighter jet. So if we send a Eurofighter, for example, which is also relatively widely proliferated, it may not always be possible to shoot American weapon systems from this Eurofighter. And so the Ukrainians would have to rely on European munition stockpiles, which is difficult. Whereas, if you fly an American jet, you have the largest ammunition reserve available to you in theory. Of course, you have to see how much is delivered. Then you can. And so that is it's by far the best choice for
just
Ukraine.
More practical.
Yeah.
But what do you think about the Western support for Ukraine? How long do you think it will last? Do you think it will last as long as the leaders say that it will last, like famously, like we will continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes, like that's what they're communicating. Do you think that's realistic, or do you think that it will run out at some point if the Western world doesn't think that we can afford this anymore? It costs too much. It has been going on for too long of a time period. We don't have any more ammunition left for ourselves, so you can get everything. What do you think, like realistically, how long will we support this war?
Yeah, I think a month ago I would have been more pessimistic on that point. I mean, overall we don't know, right? Like we don't have a crystal ball, and I think a lot depends on how well the coming Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to turn out. And also here, like a month or two ago, I would be more pessimistic. I think we can talk about it later a bit more. I think actually Ukraine has a decent shot of liberating a substantial amount of territory. But so to me, it appears over the last couple of weeks, a bit of turning point has occurred in that European decision makers, they have realized that in order for this whole situation not to end in a complete disaster, it's not enough for Ukraine to not lose, but Ukraine must win.
Okay.
And how you see it is that, countries like Germany, who have been extremely hesitant and had to be pushed to send like anything, and don't just want to like hate on Germany. They actually always stepped up and sent a lot of equipment, a really good one. But they had to be pushed and nagged all the time for months and weeks. And now suddenly, there was like 2 weeks ago or so, I suddenly see in the news that Germany has prepared another $3 billion package. And no one really asked them for it, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was just like out of the blue. I was like, what the fuck is that? And now you see that with a lot of countries. I mean, like the Scandinavian countries have been great, but they also came out, last couple of weeks and were like, hey, here's more and here's more. Denmark, especially, the Netherlands, France, all these countries suddenly, like they are really willing to provide not just really high quality weapon systems, but also, and that's really crucial, as the quantity. So like, suddenly Germany was not just sending like really good missile defense capabilities, but actually quite a lot of them.
What made them turn around, you think, from being hesitant to like, here's $3 billion? Like,
so I think it's that realization that set in that like that Ukraine needs to win. Yeah. It's because if this conflict is frozen, it's actually a bigger risk to us in the long term.
Yeah.
Than when Russia is being kicked out.
I listened to a podcast with a geopolitical scientist, researcher called Peter Zayar, and he's talking about that he thinks that Europe and the West, we're dependent on Ukraine winning this war because the alternative, we can't live with the alternative, because that means that Russia would take over Ukraine. And then what's next? Like, what's the next country they want to invade when they see that, this works, nobody cares. Well, what other countries can we take? Like, we can't have that situation. And that's the reason why Ukraine has to win. And that's the reason why we have no choice other than helping them win.
I think it's also just it's right now clear that Russia imposes huge suffering on any piece of territory that it controls. I think we've seen enough of that right now. I'm pretty sure that also makes a difference. That most European decision makers see, okay, it's not enough to freeze the conflict and let Ukrainian civilians live in tyranny under Russian control. But there actually we have a moral obligation of enabling Ukraine to liberate the territory and free their civilians.
Also, apart from the situation of nuclear arms and nuclear bombs going off, apart from that situation, which other scenarios could result in NATO getting involved in the conflict? If you see, apart from nuclear part of it.
I think nothing other than a direct attack on NATO.
Yeah.
So if Russia, in a Hail Mary attempt, decides it needs to invade Estonia to gain some leverage, then obviously that would draw us in. Other than that, I don't see a realistic scenario.
Because also Ukraine, I think, has applied for membership into NATO and also EU. Do you think that's realistic that they will get full membership in NATO while this war is going on? Or is that off the table, you think?
And I hope so, because the thing is, I'm not a expansion enthusiast. I think, like, there probably are, like, in most circumstances, there are, like, good reasons to have a proper debate about this. But when it comes to Ukraine, I don't think there's a debate, because the only way we can credibly guarantee the sovereignty of Ukraine is through NATO membership.
Yeah.
I don't think any other, scenarios that are sometimes thrown around. So, like, turning Ukraine into Israel, like arming it to the teeth with conventional weapons. I don't think that's enough.
But do you think that a NATO membership could happen during this situation, during the war? No, it could never happen like now.
No.
Because that would mean, like, NATO involvement right away.
Yeah, I think it's also, it can't, the NATO charter also prohibits that.
Yeah.
I mean, you could change that always, of course, but I don't think, no, that is not feasible. Also, EU membership is not really feasible, because not a lot of people know that, but the EU has a similar defense clause than NATO. It's a bit weaker. I mean, in the end, like, that's also a thing with NATO Article 5. A lot of people overestimate the immediacy of that article. So, Article 5 doesn't mean that we, like, immediately engage in a full-scale war. Actually, it would be totally fine that if Estonia is attacked, that Norway says, like, good luck, we're with you, thoughts and prayers. That would be fine in Article 5. There's no need to deploy military to assist an ally. And that's the same with the EU article. I think it's 33 or something like that, or 32. It's also there, like, that member states, they oblige themselves to assist other member states in case of an armed attack. And that assistance could be anything from thoughts and prayers to full-scale military support. But that's why also, EU membership is not realistic, because that would technically also draw us in, I would say.
Because now we talked about NATO and the EU, but we have a third institution that we haven't talked about. What about the UN and the UN peacekeeping forces? Could they have a role in this somehow to help Ukraine?
I mean, there's an age-old problem with the UN. It's just, it cannot deal with these situations, because the perpetrators of the crime is basically also the judge.
Yeah.
Inside, like, because Russia has a permanent seat on the Security Council.
Yeah.
And they are actually, either right now or the last time I checked, I'm not sure if they still are, but last time I heard that, I checked, they were the president, they held the presidency of the Security Council.
Oops.
So that's a bit weird, right?
Could they be kicked out of that position?
So I think only, so the thing is, the creators of the UN Charter, they were not completely stupid.
Yeah.
They put in a clause where if the UN Security Council cannot come to a decision, but a decision is necessary, it can be overwritten by the UN General Assembly. So, the UN Security Council works that, like, some countries have veto power, so they can just say no, and like, that doesn't matter. And the UN, if that happens, you can override the veto with, like, enough votes in the General Assembly. Don't know how many exactly, but it's more than a simple majority. And there have been some interesting, so the Security Council, completely useless, obviously, because either Russia vetoes it, or sometimes also China has been, that's a bit of the political support that Russia got, was sometimes through the UN representative in the Security Council. But the General Assembly, they passed some interesting votes. So, for example, they passed votes where they condemned Russian aggression, where they called on Russia to leave the Ukraine. And then very recently there was a vote. I don't know the exact phrasing, but it was basically Russia was not named as the aggressive state, but the resolution, it condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine and also in Georgia from 2008. And China did not vote against it. They abstained with a bunch of other countries that are generally aligned with Russia, India as well. So, that like Russia took some serious losses in the UN. So in that sense, the UN has been useful in, the little utility it had was that it allowed for another stage where Russia could be humiliated and further undermine this picture of an influential, powerful Russia in the world. But other than that, no, in the current conflict, I mean, no chance that peacekeepers could do anything. I would not want them to. I mean, Ukraine needs to win this war, and the best thing peacekeepers could do in a weird scenario is maybe freeze the line of contact, which is not what we want. It's not in our interest.
Because they have like a military force, right? The UN peacekeeping forces.
It would be, I mean, it's not a UN force. It would come from the member states. But if the Security Council, they could pass a resolution where they would establish a UN peacekeeping force or peace enforcement mission. And then it would be up to the UN member states to send personnel to Ukraine to enforce that agreement. You have that, for example, in Cyprus, where there's like this frozen conflict.
And you had it in Kosovo or Yugoslavia. I
was for a PhD seminar. We went to Cyprus, and I asked the general there. She's a Norwegian, actually. I asked, what happens if the fighting starts? I mean, like, what are you gonna do? And they were like, basically just leave.
Oh, really? That's much of a peacekeeping force.
You have two sides with tanks and aircraft and helicopters and
check, please.
You have the UN. There's like, it's like a strip. And the UN is surrounded on all sides. And the best they have is like guns.
So they'll stay there as long as there's peace, and then if there's war, we'll leave.
Exactly.
So there's not really peacekeeping. They're just observing the peace.
I mean, they have a real purpose, right? Like they create this buffer zone, which is really useful because it prevents clashes.
Demilitarized.
But if one side decides, no, I had enough, there's nothing the UN can do.
So they're not really like a referee. They're just peace observers. Let's observe the peace here. But what about, because I was thinking like maybe that could be a shot for Western countries to get physically into Ukraine, because they're not a NATO member. We won't go in there with NATO, but UN is like, perhaps that is a way to get in through that with military forces.
No, I don't think so. No. I mean, like, not legally, because then that would require either that Russia is not present on that day, which they wouldn't be. We had the meeting. Sorry, you weren't there. Actually, also, like, I realized today there's like so many weird, funny anecdotes in international relations. Like, another one of these is that, one of the reasons why Taiwan was for so long allowed to keep its seat in the Security Council. And it was not transferred. Like for a very long time, China in the Security Council was Taiwan, basically. And the reason why this was allowed is because the Soviet Union was just not present when they cast that vote on who should be on the Security Council. Because they, in all their wisdom, thought that by boycotting the vote, it would have bigger political influence. Which was, in hindsight, that was really not very politically savvy, because they just allowed a US ally to sit there for way longer than was necessary. That was another one of these. But no, UN Security Council, UN in general, is very important when it comes to doing anything other than symbolic political condemnation.
But what do you think about that Taiwan-China situation? Is that the next occupying military situation that's going to come up on the world scene?
Yeah, so I think definitely the most likely next conflict scenario that we have, I would say. So they're probably, I mean, again, we don't have a crystal ball. We cannot look into the decision makers' heads in China. But I think there's a decent chance that at one point in the next, 5 or 2 to 10 years maybe, that they're going to try something.
Yeah.
At least as it is right now, if the things fundamentally change, like if our security assistance to Taiwan increases substantially, or if Taiwan acquires more and more advanced conventional capabilities, maybe that will change, the thinking in China, and they might not want to pursue this operation after all. But I think it's pretty clear that at least, China is definitely preparing for a Taiwan contingency.
And is that also easier for China to do because of the Ukraine and Russia situation, that they have paved the way for them to do those kinds of things?
No, I think Xi Jinping is actually livid at Putin for his Ukraine adventure, because that has actually bolstered support for Ukraine. And people are really fed up with autocrats right now trying to impose their will and taking other states' territories, especially if it's if it fits this picture of autocracy versus democracy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think Putin is extremely unhappy with Putin, and I think what Xi Jinping wants, and that's also what China's actions indicate. Actually, I think he would prefer if this conflict is over as soon as possible, so that he can get back to planning his Taiwan invasion.
Yeah, but what do you think the U.S. response will be there? Because hasn't U.S. pledged protection for Taiwan and flying over there, or they have their ships there nearby and saying that we will defend Taiwan and such?
Yeah, it was always ambiguity around that.
Yeah.
They never made a real declaration of what they would do.
And that's a strategic ambiguity.
That was strategic ambiguity, yeah. I think actually a year ago, Biden said something along the lines that we're going to defend Taiwan.
Yeah.
And that was the first explicit security guarantee in that sense.
And what do you think happens then? Does that mean that China won't invade, or what happens if they do? And U.S. defense, what do we have then?
Landing campaigns are the most difficult ones out there. So you see how much Russia is struggling with a normal land invasion.
Yeah.
And then you can multiply the difficulty of that by X, and at one point you get the challenges of planning and conducting a landing operation, especially if it is contested. So I would actually say, unless China can achieve complete operational surprise, so that Taiwan and the US do not see it coming, I don't think a landing would succeed. So at least under the current balance of power in the region. What could happen, of course, and I think that is also the fear of a lot of American decision makers, it's not necessarily that Taiwan is taking in a blitzkrieg scenario where it's China goes in, it's over. It's more a bit similar to Ukraine, that it's bogged down. The war continues. You go into a protracted conflict scenario, but this time it does not only involve actively, a minor power and a major power, but it would involve two great powers.
Yeah.
So you would have a protracted war between China and the United States, which would be enormously costly, of course, for both countries, but also for the world economy.
And is there a nuclear worry and risk in that situation also between China and the US?
There's always, a nuclear shadow is always cast when one or more of the countries involved in the conflict have nuclear weapons. But given the doctrinal preferences of China, at least right now, where they say we're not going to use nuclear weapons first, they appear very reserved. So I don't think China has an interest in using nuclear weapons first, at least from what they say. The United States also doesn't, I think. So I think the risk would be very low.
And as long as they're quarreling about the third party, like Taiwan is not on the Chinese mainland, it's not on the US mainland, it's about this island.
So I guess the biggest risk would actually be that at one point, either China and the United States, they lost most of their conventional forces. And in order to turn the tide of the war, they start resorting to tactical nuclear weapons. And China has said that they're not doing that. So Chinese nuclear doctrine says that they do not believe in non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons. They do not possess them. They do not want to deploy them. But who knows? I mean, if push comes to shove, if they're about to lose a huge, costly war, maybe they reconsider that. And when we speak about force concentration, it may make more sense in a Taiwan scenario than a Ukraine scenario, because you could see, for example, how a tactical nuclear weapon could take out a carrier strike force. So then you might have a scenario where it makes also military sense to do that. That's maybe the biggest risk. On the other hand, I mean, United States could face the same dilemma, right? Like maybe they get to the point where their conventional forces are completely exhausted, and then they have the option between escalating to tactical nuclear weapons use or leaving it be and retreating. And then you don't know what's going to happen.
And also, I guess we would impose lots of economic sanctions on China if that would happen, like if they would invade Taiwan. And that's a big issue, because if you see like the products we use here in Norway in the West, like everything made in China. Like if that whole supply chain stops, like we saw during coronavirus, and like that would affect the whole world, that kind of a conflict.
I mean, the whole economic growth strategy of Europe is essentially based on selling stuff to China, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's especially the case for manufacturing countries, like a huge manufacturing base like Germany. I don't know too much, you know more about the Norwegian economy than I do, but I would assume that if Norway cannot sell its things to China anymore, that would also be very costly. That would not be good. So yeah, I mean, that would be a terrible scenario for Europe. That's actually, one of the reasons why, I mean, that's what the Americans get so agitated about, is that we Europeans were actually very hesitant about taking a strong stance on China, because, it will completely destroy our economies. I think it's not correct, like I think we have a moral obligation, again, like kind of same as in Ukraine, to, if there's to not allow another country to bully a smaller neighbor. But there's huge economic interest at play.
Final question. What is your your speculation, but also what do you think will happen from now on? About the situation in Ukraine and Russia, what do you see happening, like most likely scenario for how this plays out, this war, like in the short, medium term, long term?
I mean, there's this, what I always say, like the English language often has it's not as sophisticated as other languages, right? But there's a beautiful sentence in English that I find difficult translating into French or German or any other languages I know. And it's that war is contingent. Which means, that it's things like war is not random, but war, it's also not sequential. It's something in between, right? Like it's, there are a lot of things that can happen at all times. And a planner, we can plan out things and we can make scenarios and we can plan a step-by-step guide on how we want to conduct war. And we should do that. That's like our task. My task as a researcher is facilitating like this kind of planning with knowledge and expertise. But in the end, war is contingent. We don't know exactly how things are going to plan out. And I think right now in Ukraine, we are at this point where it's extremely difficult to make predictions just because we're so close to this next big thing that's going to happen. That's the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And everything is building up to that moment. And once we see how that counteroffensive is turning out, then all of us can make better assessments about where we're going in this war. Until then, I think it's really, really difficult because it all depends on this next big thing that's going to happen. If it's successful, I mean, ideally, we can see Ukraine being liberated entirely by the end of this year. Sure, absolute best case scenario, and that depends on a complete collapse of the Russian forces. Is there a 0% chance for that? Absolutely not. No. there is a non-zero possibility that Ukraine will absolutely steamroll Russia. It's not the most realistic scenario, by far not, but hey, I'm not going to exclude that. There's also the scenario where Ukraine is going to, push a tiny bit here and there, but overall, it turns out that for Ukraine, defensive operations are a lot easier than offensive operations. And then we are again in a protracted war scenario where neither side can actually, both sides can defend very well, but neither side can attack very well. And then we're going to see this thing going on for 2, 3, 5 years? Who knows how long? I am pretty certain that at one point, this war is going to end with Russian retreat. I don't know when this will be, but there is no chance that Russia can win this. Absolutely not. And the thing is, that was clear 2 weeks into the war. Some would even say 5 days into the war. Once this initial push on Kiev failed so dramatically, it was clear that Russia cannot win this war. And there's no scenario where things are going to turn around for Russia to such an extent that it will take the rest of eastern Ukraine and march into Kiev and force Ukraine to surrender and cede to Russian demands. That's absolutely out of the question. So the question we're dealing with is, how long does it take for this war to end, and how long does it take for Russia to leave? And that depends, on part on how the counteroffensive is going to turn out, how the rest of the offensive is going to turn out. But then, of course, also what happens inside Russia.
Do you think Putin will lose his job if Russia loses the war?
Most likely, but no guarantee for that.
No. And then we'll just have another person similar.
So I think that, one of the scenarios Russia gets out of the war is when there's a leadership change. And the next person coming in is just saying, okay, this was terrible. And blames it on Putin, blames it on the previous regime. Maybe not Putin, I don't know, maybe Putin negotiates a surrender inside Russia and he's allowed to live somewhere in a dacha far away. And the next person coming in is going to blame it on the chief of staff and the defense minister, and that's it. But that is, one of the scenarios. If Ukraine cannot defeat the military of Russia, then we have to wait for a Russian retreat. That could be one of the scenarios where this happens.
Okay, well, Fabian, thank you so much for coming to my podcast. There are lots of interesting stuff. You know so much, you have so much knowledge, so we could talk for 10 hours more, but you're more than welcome to join me another time also to a follow-up podcast episode.
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
And also, where can people find you online, social media?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm on Twitter. At FR Hoffmann1 is my Twitter handle. If anyone's interested.
Yeah. And where do you usually write pieces and op-eds for different kinds of newspapers and online magazines?
Yeah, so the last couple of weeks have been crazy in the sense that I produced a large amount of op-eds. That's not realistic, but if I write them, then they will either be shared on my Twitter or via the ONP, the Oslo Nuclear Project email list.
Yeah.
You will find them.
And when does your book come out? You should write a book about this.
A book? I'm first going to finish my PhD.
Yeah, then a book. All right, but thank you so much. Okay.
Yeah, no worries at all.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.